The rain came down in sheets over the Normandy coast, turning the beach into a slurry of mud and salt water. Private First Class James Sullivan crouched in the landing craft, his fingers wrapped so tightly around his M1 Garand that his knuckles had gone white beneath the grime. Around him, 37 other men sat in similar positions, their faces pale green in the dim light filtering through the grey morning sky. Some prayed silently, lips moving without sound. Others stared at nothing, their eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the metal walls that surrounded them. The boat rose and fell with each wave, and with each drop, James felt his stomach lurch. He'd never been good with boats, not even on the fishing trips his father used to take him on back in Portland, Maine. The date was June 6, 1944, and James Sullivan was 22 years old. In the breast pocket of his uniform, pressed against his heart, was a letter he'd written 3 nights ago in the barracks in England. The paper had gotten damp from the spray, and he worried the ink might run, but he kept it there anyway. It was addressed to his mother, Margaret Sullivan, at 42 Maple Street, Portland, Maine. He'd written dozens of letters home since shipping out 15 months ago, but this one was different. This one felt final in a way the others hadn't. The engine of the landing craft roared louder as they approached the shore. Sergeant William Carter stood near the ramp, his face set in the same expression of grim determination James had seen on it for the past 6 months. Carter was 34, older than most of the men, with a wife and 2 daughters back in Ohio. He'd shown James pictures once, during a quiet evening in the English countryside. The girls looked just like their father, with the same square jaw and steady eyes. 2 minutes! Carter shouted over the din of the engine and the distant thunder of artillery. Remember your training. Stay low, move fast, and watch out for your brothers. If you're watching this story unfold, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. James's hands trembled as he checked his rifle one more time. Next to him sat Tommy Reeves, a kid from Georgia who'd lied about his age to enlist. Tommy was only 17, though his papers said 19. Everyone in the platoon knew the truth, but no one said anything. The boy had lost his entire family in a house fire the year before and had nowhere else to go. James had taken him under his wing during basic training, teaching him how to field strip his rifle in under a minute and how to keep his boots dry in the trenches. "You scared, James?" Tommy asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Terrified," James answered honestly. There was no point in lying, not now. "But we do it anyway. That's what makes us soldiers." Tommy nodded, though his face had gone even paler. "My mama used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway." "Your mama was a smart woman." "Yes, sir, she was." The landing craft hit something hard, and the entire vessel shuddered. Men grabbed onto whatever they could to keep from being thrown. The ramp was going down. Through the narrow opening, James could see the beach, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Bodies littered the sand, some moving, most not. Explosions sent columns of sand and water into the air. Tracer rounds cut through the mist like deadly fireflies. The sound was deafening, a constant roar of gunfire, explosions, and men screaming. "Go! Go! Go!" Sergeant Carter was screaming, waving them forward. James surged forward with the others, his boots hitting the cold water of the English Channel. The water was deeper than he'd expected, coming up to his waist. The weight of his equipment pulled at him, threatening to drag him under. Around him, men struggled forward, some falling as bullets found them. The water turned red. Tommy was beside him, breathing hard, his eyes wide with terror, but his legs still moving. They made it 10 yards before the first man in their group went down. Private First Class Daniel Chen, a translator from San Francisco, took a round to the chest and disappeared beneath the waves without a sound. James wanted to stop, wanted to help, but Carter was screaming at them to keep moving, and he knew the sergeant was right. Stopping meant dying. The beach seemed impossibly far away. Every step was a battle against the water, the weight of his gear, and the bullets that zipped past his head. James could hear them, a strange whizzing sound that seemed almost casual until he remembered that each one could end his life in an instant. A man to his left, James didn't know his name, took a round to the throat and collapsed forward into the water, his hands clutching at the wound as blood poured between his fingers. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 2 minutes, James's boots hit sand. He threw himself forward, crawling now, keeping as low as he could. Tommy was still with him, still alive, crawling through the sand and mud toward a line of tank obstacles about 30 yards ahead. They were steel beams and wooden posts designed to stop landing craft, but right now they represented cover, safety, a chance to catch their breath. An explosion 20 feet to James's right sent him tumbling. His ears rang, and for a moment he couldn't hear anything at all. The world had gone silent, except for a high-pitched whine. He tasted blood in his mouth. He'd bitten his tongue. When his hearing started to return, the first thing he heard was Tommy screaming his name. "James! James! I'm hit!" James scrambled toward the sound, his rifle forgotten for the moment. He found Tommy lying on his side, clutching his leg. Blood was seeping through his fingers, staining the sand beneath him dark red. James pulled the kid behind a tank obstacle and ripped open his first aid kit. "Let me see it," he said, pulling Tommy's hands away. The wound was bad. A bullet had torn through the meat of his calf, and James could see bone. He worked quickly, wrapping the wound as tightly as he could with gauze, trying to remember everything they'd taught him in training about treating gunshot wounds. Apply pressure, stop the bleeding, get the wounded to a medic. "Am I gonna die?" Tommy asked, his voice small and scared, suddenly sounding every bit the 17-year-old boy he was. "Not today," James said firmly. "I won't let you." Sergeant Carter appeared beside them, materializing out of the smoke and chaos like a ghost. His face was covered in mud and someone else's blood, but his eyes were clear and focused. He took one look at Tommy's leg and nodded. "Good work, Sullivan. Can he move?" "I think so, with help." "Then get him to the seawall. That's where we're rallying. Medics are setting up there." Carter looked out at the beach, at the carnage unfolding across the sand. "We've lost half the platoon already. Everyone who can still fight needs to get to that wall. We have a job to do." James helped Tommy to his feet, or rather his foot, supporting most of the kid's weight. Together, they stumbled across the beach, zigzagging between obstacles and bodies, always moving toward the relative safety of the sea wall. Bullets continued to snap past them, but James had stopped flinching at each one. There were too many. If one had his name on it, there was nothing he could do about it anyway. They made it to the wall and collapsed against it. The stone structure was about 4 feet high, and dozens of men had taken shelter behind it. Some were wounded, being treated by harried medics. Others were catching their breath, preparing for the next phase of the assault. A young Lieutenant James didn't recognize was trying to organize them into squads, shouting orders that were barely audible over the constant roar of battle. A medic, a corporal named Jackson, came over and took a look at Tommy's leg. He worked in silence for a moment, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, then looked up at James and shook his head slightly. The wound was worse than James had thought. "He needs to get back to the ship," Jackson said. "He's losing too much blood." "No," Tommy said, grabbing James's arm. "I can still fight. I can still—" "You're going back," James said gently but firmly. "That's an order. You're not an officer. Then consider it a request from your friend. You've done your part, Tommy. You've done your country proud. Now let them patch you up so you can go home and tell everyone what happened here." Tommy's eyes filled with tears. I don't want to leave you. I'll be fine. I'm too stubborn to die." James forced a smile he didn't feel. "Besides, someone needs to be around to tell this story. Might as well be you." They loaded Tommy onto a stretcher along with 3 other wounded men, and James watched as they were carried back toward the landing craft. He didn't know if he'd ever see the kid again, but at least Tommy was off this beach. At least he had a chance. Sergeant Carter appeared again, this time with about 15 men gathered around him. "Listen up! Our objective is the bunker at the top of that bluff." He pointed to a concrete structure about 200 yards away, positioned on high ground overlooking the beach. Machine gun fire was pouring out of it, cutting down anyone who tried to advance. "Command says it needs to be taken out or this whole operation fails. We're going to take it." James looked at the bluff, at the open ground they'd have to cross to reach it, at the fortified position that was basically impregnable from a frontal assault. It was a suicide mission. Everyone looking at that bunker knew it was a suicide mission. But someone had to do it. Someone always had to do it. That's what it meant to be an American soldier. You did what needed to be done, even when the odds were impossible, even when you were scared out of your mind, even when you knew you probably wouldn't survive. You did it because the men beside you were counting on you, because the folks back home were counting on you, because freedom wasn't free and someone had to pay the price. James checked his rifle, made sure he had ammunition, and fell in line with the others. "For America," Carter said quietly. "For America," they echoed. And then they were moving again, charging up the beach toward the bunker, toward the guns that spat fire and death, toward whatever fate awaited them on that blood-soaked shore. James thought about his mother reading his letter, thought about Tommy being evacuated to the ship, thought about all the reasons men fought and died. He thought about the flag that would one day fly over this beach, bought with the blood of boys who became men in the space of a morning. The sound of gunfire intensified as they approached the bluff. Men fell around him, cut down by the withering machine gun fire. James kept running, kept his head down, kept moving forward because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing the men who depended on him. Beside him ran Private First Class Marcus Johnson, a farmer's son from Iowa, with a wife pregnant with their first child. Marcus carried a Bangalore torpedo, a long explosive charge designed to blow through barbed wire and obstacles. "We need to get this thing planted," Marcus shouted over the noise. "Cover me!" James and 3 other men formed up around Marcus, firing up at the bunker to suppress the enemy, while Marcus ran forward with the Bangalore. The German machine gunners saw what was happening and concentrated their fire on Marcus. Bullets kicked up sand all around him, but somehow miraculously none found their mark. He made it to the wire, placed the charge, and triggered it. The explosion was tremendous, tearing a gap in the defensive wire wide enough for men to pour through. But Marcus never saw the result. As he turned to run back, a burst of machine gun fire caught him across the chest. He went down hard and didn't move. "Marcus!" James screamed, but Sergeant Carter grabbed his shoulder. "He's gone, son! Keep moving! We use what he gave us!" They surged through the gap in the wire, scrambling up the bluff toward the bunker. The slope was steep and muddy, and James had to use his hands to pull himself up in places. The Germans above threw grenades down at them, but most rolled past or exploded harmlessly in the sand. One landed close enough to shower James with dirt and stones, but he kept climbing. Somehow, impossibly, James reached the top of the bluff. He rolled over the edge and came up firing, his rifle barking in his hands. The Germans defending this position were young, some of them looking no older than Tommy. They fought hard, but they were outnumbered now and outflanked. The battle for the bunker itself was brutal and close quarters, fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. James found himself face to face with a German soldier, both of them out of ammunition. They grappled for a moment before James managed to land a solid punch that dropped the other man. When the shooting finally stopped, 8 Americans and 12 Germans lay dead around the bunker. Sergeant Carter was wounded, a grazing shot across his ribs, but he was still on his feet and still giving orders. They'd taken the position. James walked to the front of the bunker and looked down at Omaha Beach. From this vantage point, he could see the entire scope of the invasion. Thousands of men were pouring ashore now, the initial assault having broken through the defenses. Bodies littered the sand, but the living pressed forward, carrying out their mission despite the cost. Ships offshore continued to bombard German positions further inland. The sky was full of aircraft, both Allied and German, engaged in deadly dogfights. He pulled the letter from his pocket, unfolded it carefully. The ink had run in places, but most of it was still legible. He read his own words, written 3 nights ago, when he'd somehow known, deep in his bones, that this was it. This was the moment everything would change. Dear Mom, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear, but I need you to understand something. What we're about to do, what thousands of us are about to attempt, it matters. It matters more than anything I've ever done in my life. I'm not a hero, Mom. I'm just a kid from Portland who wanted to do his part. But standing here tonight, looking at the men around me, I see heroes everywhere. I see men who left behind families, jobs, dreams, everything they held dear, to stand up against tyranny. That's what this is about. Not glory, not adventure, but standing up when it counts. Tell Dad I tried to make him proud. Tell Sarah I expect her to be running that library by the time the war is over. She's smart enough to run anything she sets her mind to. And Mom, please don't be sad. I've lived more in these last 15 months than some men live in a lifetime. I've seen the world, made friends I'll never forget, and learned what it really means to be an American. It means doing what's right even when it's hard. It means standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. It means being part of something bigger than yourself. I love you, Mom. I love Dad and Sarah and everyone back home. That's what I'll be thinking about tomorrow, when the ramp drops and we hit the beach. I'll be thinking about home, about America, about everything worth fighting for. Your loving son, James. Sergeant Carter came up beside him, saw the letter and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "She'd be proud of you, Sullivan. What you did today, getting that kid off the beach, helping take this bunker, you're the kind of soldier this country needs." James folded the letter carefully and put it back in his pocket. "We all did what needed to be done, Sarge." "That's right, and we're not finished yet." Carter pointed inland toward the French countryside beyond the beach. "We've got a lot of fighting ahead of us. A lot of boys are going to die before this is over, but we're going to win. You know how I know?" "How?" "Because of men like you, like Marcus, like every soldier who hit that beach today knowing the odds and doing it anyway. That's the American spirit right there. That's what's going to win this war." As the sun began to set on that longest day, James Sullivan stood among the ruins of the German bunker and looked out at the beach below, at the terrible price that had been paid for this small piece of French coastline. He thought about all the letters that would need to be written, all the mothers who would receive news they never wanted to hear, all the futures that had ended today on this blood-soaked sand. But he also thought about what came next, about pushing inland, about liberating France, about ending the Nazi regime that had brought so much suffering to the world. He thought about the America he was fighting for, not perfect, never perfect, but always striving to be better, always standing up when it mattered most. The letter in his pocket felt heavy, a reminder of his own mortality. But it was also a reminder of why he was here, why all of them were here. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves, for ideals that transcended national borders, for the simple truth that all people deserved to live free from tyranny and oppression. Night fell over Normandy, bringing with it a temporary lull in the fighting. James found a dry spot in the bunker and sat down, his back against the concrete wall. Around him, other survivors did the same, too exhausted to do anything but sit and breathe, and thank whatever gods might be listening that they'd made it through the day. Tomorrow they would push inland. Tomorrow more men would die. But tonight, James Sullivan was alive. He'd kept his promise to himself, to his country, to the men who'd fought beside him. He'd done his duty, and somehow, in that moment, that was enough. The next morning arrived with an eerie calm that felt wrong after the chaos of the previous day. James woke to find frost covering his uniform, his breath forming small clouds in the cold Norman air. His entire body ached, muscles he didn't know he had screamed in protest as he tried to move. Around him, the other survivors of the bunker assault were stirring slowly, like old men rather than soldiers in their 20s. Sergeant Carter was already awake, studying a map by the dim light of dawn. His face was drawn and haggard, the wound on his ribs bandaged but clearly painful. When he saw James looking at him, he waved him over. "Sullivan, good. You're on point today. We're moving out in 30 minutes. "Where are we headed, Sarge?" Carter pointed to a spot on the map about 5 miles inland. "Small town called Sainte-Mère-Église. Paratroopers took it last night, but they're getting hit hard by German counterattacks. Command wants us to link up with them, reinforce their position." He looked up from the map, his eyes meeting James's. "It's going to be a hot route. Germans are dug in along the hedgerows, and intelligence says there's at least 1 panzer unit in the area." James nodded, his stomach tightening at the mention of tanks. Infantry against armor was never a fair fight. "How many men do we have?" "Counting everyone who made it off the beach yesterday, about 40. We're combining what's left of 3 different platoons." Carter rolled up the map. "It's not much, but it'll have to do. This is war, Sullivan. You fight with what you have, not what you wish you had." The column moved out as the sun rose over the French countryside. James took point as ordered, his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead for any sign of danger. Behind him stretched a ragged line of soldiers, all of them bearing the marks of yesterday's battle. Dirty uniforms, bandaged wounds, the 1,000-yard stare of men who'd seen too much death in too short a time. The Norman countryside was beautiful in a way that seemed to mock their purpose. Rolling fields stretched in every direction, divided by the famous hedgerows, thick walls of earth and vegetation that had been there for centuries. Wildflowers bloomed in the grass, birds sang in the trees. It looked like paradise, but James knew better. Those hedgerows could hide entire companies of German soldiers. Those fields could be mined. That peaceful farmhouse in the distance could contain a machine gun nest. They'd gone about 2 miles when the first shots rang out. James hit the ground instinctively, pressing himself against the base of a hedgerow. Around him, the other men did the same. The gunfire was coming from somewhere ahead, single shots rather than sustained bursts. A sniper. "Stay low!" Carter shouted. "Sullivan, can you spot him?" James carefully raised his head, scanning the terrain ahead. There, a slight movement in the second-story window of a farmhouse about 300 yards away. The glint of metal, probably a rifle scope catching the morning light. "Farmhouse," James called back. "Second floor, right window." "Can you take the shot?" James considered it. 300 yards with an M1 Garand wasn't impossible, but it wasn't easy either. The rifle was designed for closer combat, and he'd be shooting at a small target. But someone had to try, and he'd always been a good shot back in Maine, hunting deer in the woods with his father. "I can try." He shifted position slightly, getting more comfortable, letting his breathing slow. The world narrowed to just him, his rifle, and that distant window. He thought about all the hours he'd spent as a kid. His father teaching him to shoot, to lead a moving target, to compensate for wind and distance. He thought about the deer he'd taken down with single shots, quick and clean, and tried not to think about the fact that this time he was aiming at a man. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. Through the dissipating smoke, James saw the window shatter, saw a figure slump forward. The shooting stopped. "Good shot," Carter said quietly. Then, louder, "Move out, stay spread out and keep your eyes open." They continued forward, more cautious now, knowing the area was occupied. Every hedgerow could hide an ambush. Every shadow could conceal an enemy. James's nerves were stretched taut, his finger never far from his trigger. The ambush, when it came, was swift and brutal. They were crossing an open field when machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions along the far hedgerow. Men went down immediately, cut down before they could react. James threw himself flat and army crawled toward the nearest cover, a shallow depression in the ground that provided minimal protection. "Suppressing fire!" Carter was screaming. "Keep their heads down!" The Americans returned fire, but they were caught in the open with no good cover. James could see muzzle flashes along the hedgerow, at least 3 different machine gun positions. They were pinned down, taking casualties, and if they didn't do something soon, the entire unit would be wiped out. A soldier James recognized as Private First Class, Robert Hayes, crawled up beside him. Hayes was from Texas, a former ranch hand who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor. He was carrying a bar, a Browning automatic rifle, and his face was set with grim determination. "We need to flank them," Hayes said. "If we can get around to their left, we might be able to take out at least one of those gun positions." "That's a suicide run," James replied. "You'd have to cross at least 50 yards of open ground." "You got a better idea?" James didn't. He looked at the men around him, saw them being picked off one by the relentless machine gun fire. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't retreat across the open field. They had to attack. "I'll go with you," James said. Hayes grinned, though there was no humor in it. "Figured you would. On 3? They counted down together, then exploded into motion, running low and fast along the hedgerow. Bullets chased them, kicking up dirt and grass, but somehow both men made it to the corner and around it. Now they were on the German flank, and James could see the nearest machine gun position clearly. 2 soldiers manning an MG-42, so focused on the Americans in the field that they hadn't noticed the threat from the side. James and Hayes opened fire simultaneously. The 2 German soldiers went down, and the murderous fire from that position ceased. But the other guns had spotted them now, and bullets began tearing into the hedgerow around them. "Grenade!" Hayes shouted, pulling one from his belt. He pulled the pin, counted to 2, then hurled it toward the second machine gun position. The explosion was followed by screams, and that gun fell silent as well. With 2 of the 3 positions neutralized, the Americans in the field were able to advance. They poured through the gap, overwhelming the final machine gun nest through sheer numbers and determination. The entire engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes, but when it was over, 12 Americans lay dead or wounded in that field. Sergeant Carter organized the survivors quickly, getting the wounded patched up and redistributing ammunition. They'd used a lot in that firefight, and supplies were precious. James found himself down to just 3 clips for his rifle, 24 rounds. He'd have to make them count. "We're close now," Carter said, pointing to a church steeple visible in the distance. "That's Sainte-Mère-Église. Another mile, maybe less. But intel says there are German troops between us and the town. We need to push through." The men moved forward again, more slowly now, checking every hedgerow before crossing, sending scouts ahead to make sure the route was clear. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work, but it kept them alive. They encountered the next German position at a crossroads. A Panzer IV tank sat in the middle of the intersection, its 75mm gun pointed down one of the roads. Infantry supported it, dug into positions on either side of the road. It was a formidable defensive position, and James felt his heart sink when he saw it. They had no anti-tank weapons, no bazookas, no way to take out that armored monster. "Fall back," Carter ordered. "We'll find another route." But before they could withdraw, the Panzer's engine roared to life. Someone had spotted them. The turret began to traverse, the long gun swinging toward their position. If that gun fired, everyone in the immediate area would die. James acted on instinct without thinking, without considering the consequences. He broke from cover and ran directly at the tank, zigzagging to make himself a harder target. He could hear Carter screaming his name, but he didn't stop. He'd seen a weakness. The tank's vision ports were open, and if he could get close enough... He pulled a grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and cooked it for 2 seconds. Then, just as he reached the tank, he threw it through the open vision port. He dove away, hit the ground hard, and covered his head with his arms. The explosion inside the tank was muffled but devastating. Smoke began pouring out of the vision ports and hatches. The turret stopped moving. The engine died. For a moment, there was silence, and then the German infantry, seeing their armored support disabled, broke and ran. James lay on the ground, breathing hard, not quite able to believe he was still alive. Carter was suddenly there, pulling him to his feet, shaking him. "Are you insane?" the sergeant demanded. "What were you thinking?" "I wasn't," James admitted. "I just saw an opening and took it." Carter stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're either the bravest son of a bitch I've ever met or the craziest, maybe both." He clapped James on the shoulder. "Good work, Sullivan. That was one hell of a play." They reached Sainte-Mère-Église an hour later, linking up with the paratroopers who'd seized the town the night before. The paratroopers looked even worse than the beach landing force. They'd been fighting continuously since dropping behind enemy lines, and their casualties had been severe. But they were still holding the town, still denying it to the Germans, still doing their duty. The commander of the paratrooper force, a captain named Morrison, briefed them on the situation. "We've beaten back 3 counterattacks in the last 12 hours. The Germans want this town back. It's a key road junction, and they know it. Intelligence says they're massing for another push, probably within the next few hours. We need every man who can hold a rifle on the defensive line." James found himself assigned to a position in the town square, behind a hastily constructed barricade of furniture and rubble. Around him were a mix of paratroopers and beach assault survivors, all of them exhausted, all of them determined. They checked weapons, shared ammunition, and waited for the attack they knew was coming. The sun was setting when the German artillery began. Shells rained down on the town, destroying buildings, tearing up the streets, killing men who'd survived D-Day only to die here. James pressed himself against the barricade, feeling each explosion in his chest, wondering if the next one would have his name on it. Then came the infantry, waves of German soldiers advancing down the roads toward the town. James opened fire, his rifle finding targets, dropping men who were just following orders like he was, just trying to survive like he was. The defensive line held, but barely. The Germans came again, and each time the defenders threw them back. But the cost was terrible. In the midst of the battle, James saw a young paratrooper, couldn't have been more than 19, take a round to the stomach. The kid went down hard, and James could see immediately that the wound was mortal. He crawled over to the dying soldier, cradling his head. "Mom," the kid whispered, his eyes unfocused. "Mom, is that you?" "Yeah, son," James lied gently. "I'm here. You're going to be okay. I'm sorry I didn't write more. I meant to write more letters. She knows. She understands. You've made her so proud." The kid smiled faintly, and then he was gone. James closed the boy's eyes and crawled back to his position, fighting back tears, fighting back the rage and grief that threatened to overwhelm him. The battle raged through the night, but when dawn came, the Germans pulled back. They'd lost too many men trying to retake the town, and the American position was growing stronger by the hour as more reinforcements arrived from the beach. Sainte-Mère-Église would remain in Allied hands. James sat with his back against a wall, so tired he could barely keep his eyes open. Around him, other survivors were doing the same, catching whatever rest they could before the next fight, the next mission, the next test of their courage and endurance. Sergeant Carter found him there and sat down beside him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Carter said quietly, "You did good, Sullivan. Real good. Your country can be proud of you." "I just did what needed to be done, Sarge. Same as everyone else." "That's what makes you a hero. Not that you did something extraordinary, but that you did what was necessary when it mattered most." Carter pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and took a long drag. "This war isn't over. We've got a long road ahead of us, a lot more fighting, a lot more dying. But days like yesterday, days like today, they matter. They're why we're going to win." James thought about the letter in his pocket, about his mother reading it, about the promise he'd made to do his duty. He thought about Tommy Reeves, hopefully recovering on a hospital ship somewhere. He thought about Marcus Johnson, dying to clear a path for others. He thought about that nameless paratrooper, calling for his mother with his last breath. "For America," James said softly. "For America," Carter echoed. And as the sun rose over the battered town of Sainte-Mère-Église, James Sullivan knew that whatever came next, whatever trials and battles lay ahead, he would face them. Because that's what American soldiers did. They stood up when it mattered. They fought when others couldn't. They paid the price of freedom with their blood and their sacrifice. And they never, ever backed down. The letter remained in his pocket, unread by his mother, because James Sullivan was still alive, still fighting, still doing his duty. The story it told would have to wait for another day, if that day ever came. But for now, for this moment, that was enough. 3 weeks had passed since D-Day, and the Allied advance through Normandy had become a brutal slog through the hedgerows. Each field was a fortress, each hedgerow a potential death trap. The Germans had learned to use the terrain to their advantage, turning every square mile of French countryside into a killing ground. James Sullivan had aged years in those 3 weeks, his face now bearing the same haunted expression he'd seen on Sergeant Carter's face that first day on Omaha Beach. The unit, what remained of it, had been reinforced twice, but the new replacements never lasted long. Boys fresh from training would arrive wide-eyed and eager, and within days they'd be dead or broken, or both. James had stopped learning their names after the first week. It hurt less that way. They were bivouacked in a ruined farmhouse 5 miles south of Carrington when the orders came down. Captain Morrison, promoted after the defense of Sainte-Mère-Église, gathered the squad leaders around a makeshift table fashioned from an old door laid across 2 ammunition crates. "Gentlemen, we've got a problem," Morrison began, spreading out a map marked with red and blue pencil lines. "Intelligence reports indicate the Germans are massing armor here." He pointed to a wooded area about 10 miles to the southeast, "for a major counterattack. If they break through, they could cut our supply lines and trap 3 divisions on the wrong side of the Vire River." Sergeant Carter, who'd been promoted to staff sergeant after losing 2 fingers on his left hand to shrapnel, studied the map intently. "What's the mission, sir?" "We need eyes on that forest. Confirm the intelligence, get an accurate count of armor and troops, and relay the information back to command so they can call in air support." Morrison looked around at the assembled sergeants, his expression grim. "It's a reconnaissance mission, but it's going to be dangerous. The area is crawling with Germans, and you'll be operating behind enemy lines with no support." "How many men?" Carter asked. "I'm giving you 8, your best." "This isn't a fighting mission. If you make contact, you've failed. Get in, get the intel, get out." Morrison's eyes found James. "Sullivan, you're going. Carter says you've got good eyes and a cool head." James nodded, feeling his stomach tighten. A recon mission deep behind enemy lines was one of the most dangerous assignments in the infantry. If they were spotted, if they were caught, there would be no rescue, no reinforcements. They'd be on their own. The team assembled at midnight. James, Carter, Robert Hayes with his bar, a combat engineer named Frank Kowalski who'd transferred in from the 1st Infantry Division, a radio man named Eddie Chen, no relation to Daniel Chen who died on D-Day, and 3 replacements who'd arrived just 2 days earlier. The replacements were kids, all of them under 20, and James could see the fear in their eyes. He remembered having that same fear once, though it seemed like a lifetime ago now. They moved through the night in single file, James on point, using the moonlight to navigate by. The Norman countryside was different in darkness, more sinister, every shadow potentially concealing an enemy soldier, every sound magnified by the quiet. An owl hooting made James's heart race. A branch breaking under someone's boot sounded like a gunshot. They covered 6 miles in 4 hours, moving slowly and carefully, avoiding roads and open areas. Twice they had to hide while German patrols passed within 50 feet of their position. James lay in the wet grass, barely breathing, watching the enemy soldiers walk by, so close he could have reached out and touched them. His hand was tight on his rifle, ready to fight if they were discovered, but the patrols passed without incident. As dawn approached, they reached the edge of the forest Morrison had indicated. Carter signaled for them to take cover in a dense thicket while he and James moved forward to scout. They crawled through the underbrush, moving inch by inch until they could see into a clearing in the heart of the woods. What they saw made James's blood run cold. Tanks, at least 20 of them, a mix of Panzer V's and the newer, more deadly Panthers. Half-tracks filled with infantry, artillery pieces being positioned, supply trucks, command vehicles. It wasn't just a counterattack force, it was an entire armored battalion, easily enough firepower to punch through the American lines and wreak havoc in the rear areas. "We need to get this information back," Carter whispered. "Chen, get on the radio." They crawled back to where the others waited. Eddie Chen quickly set up his radio equipment, stringing the antenna between 2 trees, adjusting frequencies. But when he tried to transmit, he got nothing but static. "Something's jamming us," Chen said, frustrated. "I can't get through." Carter considered their options. "How far to the nearest Allied position?" 6, maybe 7 miles, James answered. "But we'd have to cross the German lines to get there." "We don't have a choice. This information is too important. If that armor moves out and we haven't warned command, thousands of our boys are going to die." Carter looked at his watch. "It's 05:30 now. We move fast, stay low, we can be back by 1100. Chen, pack up that radio. We're moving." They began the journey back, but everything that had gone right during the night now went wrong in the daylight. They'd barely gone 2 miles when one of the replacements, a kid named Miller from Wisconsin, stepped on a mine. The explosion was devastating, killing Miller instantly and severely wounding another replacement named Foster. The third replacement, a boy named Jackson, went into shock, just sitting on the ground and staring at what was left of his friends. "We've got to move," Carter hissed. "That explosion will bring every German in 5 miles down on us." But Foster was bleeding out, and Jackson couldn't seem to process what was happening. Hayes and Kowalski grabbed Foster, making a stretcher from their rifles and jackets, while James physically hauled Jackson to his feet and pushed him forward. They ran now, abandoning stealth for speed. Behind them they could hear shouting in German, the sound of vehicles starting up. They'd been spotted, and the hunt was on. The chase through the Norman countryside was a nightmare. German soldiers seemed to be everywhere, cutting off routes, forcing the Americans to constantly change direction. They lost their bearings, ended up in a small village that turned out to be occupied by an entire German company. A firefight erupted, brief but brutal. Kowalski went down with a bullet through his shoulder. Hayes's bar ran dry, and he switched to a captured German rifle. They fought their way out of the village and into a ravine, where they finally managed to lose their pursuers. But the cost had been terrible. Foster had died during the running firefight. Jackson had taken a round to the leg and couldn't walk. Kowalski was in bad shape, losing blood despite James's best efforts to bandage the wound. Carter made the decision quickly. Hayes, Chen, you two get Kowalski and Jackson back to our lines. Sullivan and I will continue the mission. Command needs this intelligence, and we're running out of time. Sarge, you can't— Hayes started to protest. That's an order, Private. Get these men to safety and report what we found. If Sullivan and I don't make it back, at least someone will have delivered the message. Carter's face was set. No room for argument. Go, now. Hayes and Chen helped the wounded men up and headed west toward the American lines. James watched them go, wondering if he'd ever see them again. Then he turned to Carter. Just the two of us, Sarge. Just the two of us. Carter checked his ammunition, down to 2 clips, and nodded toward the east. Let's move. We've got a war to win. They traveled through the day, 2 men alone in enemy territory, carrying information that could save thousands of lives. They avoided German patrols through a combination of luck, skill, and sheer determination. When they had to hide, they hid. When they had to fight, they fought. And always, always, they kept moving toward the American lines. It was late afternoon when they finally saw friendly forces, a forward observation post manned by a platoon from the 29th Infantry Division. James and Carter stumbled into the position, exhausted, filthy, barely able to stand. But they'd made it. The lieutenant in command listened to their report with growing alarm, then immediately got on the radio to division headquarters. Within an hour, plans were being made. Airstrikes were called in, artillery batteries were repositioned. Reserves were moved up to reinforce the threatened sector. That night, American bombers hit the German armor concentration in the forest. Fighter bombers followed at dawn. When the Germans finally launched their counterattack, they did so with half their expected strength, and the attack was beaten back with heavy losses. Captain Morrison visited James and Carter in the field hospital where they were recovering. Carter from exhaustion and infection in his wounded hand, James from a bout of dysentery that had hit him hard after they'd reached safety. You two saved a lot of lives, Morrison said simply. Command wants to put you both in for Silver Stars. You did your country proud. After Morrison left, Carter looked over at James from the adjacent cot. You ever think about what we're doing here, Sullivan? I mean, really think about it? Every day, Sarge. We're just ordinary men, you know. Farmers, factory workers, kids fresh out of high school. But we're doing extraordinary things. We're changing the course of history. Carter stared at the ceiling. My girls. They're 7 and 9 now. By the time I see them again, they'll be different. I'll be different, but maybe the world will be different too. Maybe it'll be better. That's what we're fighting for, James said. A better world. A free world. Yeah? Carter was quiet for a moment. You still carrying that letter? James patted his pocket. Still here. Maybe you should mail it. Let your mother know you're okay. Maybe, but then I'd have to write a new one just in case. Fair point. They lay in silence for a while, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. The war went on, with or without them, but for this moment they could rest. They'd done their duty, they'd paid their price, and they'd live to fight another day. 2 days later, they were back with their unit, preparing for the next operation. The advance continued. The hedgerows fell one by one, and James Sullivan, ordinary man from Portland, Maine, kept doing what needed to be done, kept standing up when it mattered, kept embodying the spirit that made America great. Because that's what American soldiers did. They didn't quit. They didn't surrender. They faced impossible odds and found a way to win. For freedom, for country, for the promise of a better tomorrow. The liberation of St. Lo came in mid-July, after weeks of the bloodiest fighting James had ever experienced. The city was a strategic objective. Whoever controlled it controlled the roads leading into the interior of France. The Germans knew this, and they'd fortified every building, every street corner, every rubble pile. Taking the city required the Americans to fight for every yard, every room, every window. James's company was assigned to clear the eastern quarter of the city. They moved through the ruins in small teams, checking buildings, rooting out snipers, clearing cellars where German soldiers hid. It was exhausting, terrifying work. You never knew when you'd open a door and find a machine gun nest waiting, or when a grenade would come bouncing down a stairwell, or when the building you were in would collapse from artillery fire. On the third day of the urban fighting, James's team was clearing a large apartment building when they heard crying. Not the crying of wounded soldiers, but the high-pitched wail of a child. James held up his fist, signaling the others to stop. They listened, trying to pinpoint the source. "Basement," Carter said quietly. "Sounds like it's coming from the basement." They descended carefully, weapons ready, not knowing what they'd find. The basement door was partially blocked by rubble, but they managed to force it open. Inside, huddled in the corner, were 6 French civilians, an elderly woman, 2 younger women, and 3 children, the youngest barely a toddler. The sight of American soldiers caused an immediate reaction. The elderly woman began speaking rapidly in French, tears streaming down her face. James didn't speak French, but he understood the emotion: relief, gratitude, hope. These people had been trapped here for days, hiding from the fighting, terrified that each explosion might be the one that buried them alive. "Chen!" James called up the stairs. Eddie Chen came down, and James was suddenly grateful the radio man had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, where he'd picked up some French from Vietnamese neighbors. "Can you understand what she's saying?" Chen listened for a moment, then translated. "She says they've been here for 5 days. No food, almost no water. The children are hungry. She's asking if we're really Americans, if they're really safe now." "Tell her yes," James said. "Tell her we're going to get them out of here." But getting them out was easier said than done. The streets were still under fire, and escorting civilians through an active combat zone was dangerous for everyone involved. Carter made the call to hold position in the basement until nightfall, then try to move the civilians back to the American aid station under cover of darkness. They spent the afternoon there, sharing what little food and water they had with the French family. One of the younger women spoke a bit of English. She'd been a schoolteacher before the war, and through her, James learned their story. The elderly woman was the teacher's mother. The other young woman was her sister. The 3 children were her sister's kids. Her sister's husband had been killed by the Germans 2 years ago for being part of the resistance. "Thank you," the teacher said to James, her English heavily accented but clear. "Thank you for coming, for liberating France. We had almost given up hope." "We made a promise," James replied. "America keeps its promises." That night, under a moonless sky, they moved the civilians through the ruined streets. Carter took point, James brought up the rear, and the others surrounded the French family. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to listen for German patrols or movement in the darkness. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every sound made James's trigger finger itch. They were 3 blocks from the aid station when the ambush happened. German soldiers had set up a checkpoint at an intersection, and the Americans walked right into it. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as both sides opened fire simultaneously. "Get the civilians down!" James screamed, pushing the teacher and her family into a doorway. The children were crying, the women screaming. Bullets chipped away at the walls around them, showering everyone with stone fragments. The firefight was close and chaotic. James found himself face to face with a German soldier, both of them coming around opposite sides of a wall at the same time. They fired simultaneously. James felt something hot tear across his ribs, but his shot found its mark, and the German went down. He pressed his hand to his side, felt blood, but there was no time to worry about it now. Carter threw a grenade that took out the German position, and suddenly the street was quiet, except for the ringing in everyone's ears. They'd won, but at a cost. One of their team, a replacement whose name James had never learned, lay dead in the street. Another was wounded, shot through the leg. They limped to the aid station, all of them bleeding, all of them exhausted. The medics took the wounded and the French family, and James finally allowed someone to look at his wound. The bullet had creased his ribs, painful but not serious. He'd have a scar, but he'd live. The teacher found him later, after the medics had bandaged him up. She took his hand in both of hers, tears in her eyes. "You saved our lives. You risked everything for us. I will never forget. France will never forget." James didn't know what to say. He'd just done what any American soldier would do, protected the innocent, stood up against tyranny, paid the price of freedom with his own blood. It was what they'd all signed up for, what they'd all promised to do. "Just doing my duty, ma'am," he said finally. She kissed his cheek, European style, and said something in French. Then, in English, "You are a hero, a true American hero." After she left, Carter sat down beside James. "That was good work today, Sullivan. Saving those people. That's what this is all about. That's why we're here." "I know, Sarge. But it doesn't make it easier. Doesn't make the dying easier, or the killing, or any of it." "No," Carter agreed. "It doesn't. War is hell, and anyone who tells you different is selling something. But we're fighting for something that matters. Every French family we liberate, every town we take back from the Nazis, every day we push them further back, it all matters." St. Lo finally fell on July 18th. The city was a wasteland, 90% destroyed by the fighting, but it was free. American flags flew over the rubble, and French civilians who'd survived the battle emerged from their hiding places, weeping and cheering and embracing the soldiers who'd freed them. James stood in what had once been the city square, looking at the devastation around him, so much destruction, so much death, but also hope. The French tricolour flew alongside the American flag, and civilians were already starting to dig out, to rebuild, to reclaim their city from the ashes. A photographer from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, was documenting the liberation. He spotted James and came over. "Hey, soldier. Mind if I get your picture? Human interest story, the men who took St. Lo." James was too tired to refuse. He stood there while the photographer snapped a few shots, his uniform filthy and torn, his face covered in several days' worth of stubble, his eyes carrying that 1,000-yard stare that all combat veterans eventually developed. "What's your name, soldier?" the photographer asked. "Where you from?" "Private First Class James Sullivan, Portland, Maine." "What would you say to the folks back home? What would you want them to know about what you're doing here?" James thought about that letter in his pocket, about his mother and father and sister back in Maine, about all the families waiting for news of their sons and husbands and fathers. He thought about what he'd seen, what he'd done, what it all meant. "Tell them we're doing what Americans do," he said finally. "We're standing up for what's right. We're fighting for freedom, not just for ourselves, but for people we've never met, in countries we'd never heard of before this war. Tell them it's hard, and it hurts, and we're scared, but we're not quitting. America doesn't quit." The photographer wrote it all down, then thanked James and moved on to interview other soldiers. Carter, who'd been standing nearby, came over and clapped James on the shoulder. "That was good what you said, about America not quitting. It's true, isn't it? That's what makes us different. We could have stayed out of this war, could have let Europe burn. But we didn't, because that's not who we are." "No," Carter agreed. "That's not who we are." That night, the company was pulled back from the front lines for a brief rest. They'd earned it. They'd been in continuous combat for 6 weeks, had taken 50% casualties, and needed time to integrate replacements and refit. The men found billets in a small village 5 miles behind the lines, a place that had been liberated weeks ago and was relatively untouched by the fighting. James found himself billeted in a farmhouse with an elderly French couple who spoke no English but communicated through smiles and gestures. They insisted on feeding him, despite having very little food themselves. The meal was simple: bread, cheese, a bit of wine, but it was the first time in weeks James had eaten something that wasn't from a can or a field kitchen. After dinner, the old farmer brought out a guitar and played folk songs while his wife sang. James didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion. These were songs of home, of peace, of life before the war. They reminded him of his father playing fiddle on summer evenings in Maine, of his mother singing while she worked in the garden, of a life that seemed impossibly distant now. When the singing ended, James pulled out the letter he'd written before D-Day. It was battered now, the paper soft from being handled so many times, some of the ink smudged. But it was still readable. He thought about what Carter had said, about mailing it, about letting his mother know he was okay. But then he thought about all the men who hadn't been okay, who died in the 6 weeks since D-Day: Marcus Johnson, Daniel Chen, Miller and Foster, that nameless paratrooper calling for his mother, dozens of others whose names he'd never learned or had forgotten. They didn't get to write letters home. They didn't get to reassure their families. All their families would receive was a telegram and a flag. No, James decided. The letter stayed with him. When the war was over, if he survived that long, he'd go home in person. He'd tell his mother face to face about everything he'd seen and done. Until then, the letter was a reminder of why he fought, a connection to the person he'd been before the war, a promise he'd made to himself. He folded the letter carefully and put it back in his pocket over his heart, where it had been since June 6th. Then he lay back on the cot the French couple had provided and tried to sleep, knowing that in a few days they'd be back in action, back in the fight, back to doing what American soldiers do. The next morning brought news that would change everything. The breakout from Normandy was beginning. Operation Cobra, a massive offensive designed to punch through the German lines and race across France toward Germany itself. Every unit was being mobilized, every soldier needed. The brief rest was over. James and his company moved up to the jump-off point, taking positions in the line alongside thousands of other American soldiers. The mood was different now, more confident. They'd proven they could take the hedgerows, could clear the cities, could beat the Germans at their own game. Now it was time to finish the job. The artillery barrage that preceded the attack was the heaviest James had ever experienced. For hours, American guns pounded the German positions, turning the landscape ahead into a moonscape of craters and devastation. Then came the bombers, wave after wave of them, carpet-bombing the German lines until it seemed impossible that anything could have survived. When the barrage finally lifted, the infantry went forward. James was part of the first wave, moving fast now, not fighting for every hedgerow, but racing through gaps in the German defenses, bypassing strong points, driving deep into enemy territory. The breakthrough had succeeded. The German lines were collapsing. The race across France had begun. For 3 weeks, James's company was part of the spearhead driving east. They liberated town after town, village after village. French civilians lined the roads, cheering, throwing flowers, kissing the soldiers as they passed. Children ran alongside the trucks and tanks, waving small American flags. Old men who'd fought in the First World War saluted with tears streaming down their faces. It was intoxicating, this feeling of liberation, of victory. After the grinding brutality of the hedgerow fighting, this felt like what they'd been promised war would be. A noble cause, a righteous fight, heroes welcomed by a grateful people. James found himself smiling for the first time in weeks, caught up in the momentum, the sense that they were really winning now, that the end might actually be in sight. But war has a way of reminding soldiers that victory always comes with a price. That reminder came outside a small town called Morton, where the Germans launched a desperate counterattack designed to cut off the American advance. James's company, which had been leading the advance, suddenly found itself surrounded, cut off from the rest of the division, fighting for survival. The battle for Mortain lasted 3 days. The Americans held a hill overlooking the town, and the Germans threw everything they had at it: tanks, infantry, artillery. The hilltop became a slaughterhouse, littered with dead from both sides. James fought until his rifle barrel was too hot to touch, until he'd gone through all his ammunition and had to scavenge more from the dead. He fought until his hands shook and his vision blurred from exhaustion. On the second night, during a lull in the fighting, Carter gathered what remained of the company, maybe 20 men out of the 80 who'd started the battle. "Listen up," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "Division knows we're here. They're trying to break through to us. But we have to hold this hill. If we lose it, the Germans cut the supply lines and the whole offensive collapses. Everything we've fought for, everyone who's died, it'll all be for nothing if we don't hold." "How long, Sarge?" someone asked. "As long as it takes." They held. Through that night and the next day and another night, they held. Men died holding that hill. Good men, brave men, American men who understood what was at stake and paid the price willingly. But they held. On the morning of the third day, American tanks broke through the German lines and relieved the hilltop defenders. Of the 20 men who'd been there at the start of the siege, only 12 walked off that hill. James was one of them, but he'd left something behind on that blood-soaked ground, some last piece of innocence, some final illusion about the glory of war. The advance continued after Mortain, but it was different for James now. The euphoria of the breakout was gone, replaced by a grim determination. He'd fight because he had to, because his country needed him to, because the men beside him depended on him. But he no longer had any illusions about what war meant. In late August, the company reached the Seine River. Across the water lay Paris, and beyond Paris, Germany itself. The end was closer, but James knew better than to think about that now. He'd learned to take things one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, one breath at a time. That night, sitting by the river with Carter, James finally took out the letter and showed it to the sergeant. Carter read it slowly, carefully, then handed it back. "You should send it," Carter said. "Let your mother know you're alive. If I send it, I'll have to write a new one. So write a new one. Write one every week if you have to, but let her know you're okay. That's what she needs most." James considered that. Maybe Carter was right. Maybe it was time to let his mother know he'd survived this far, to give her some measure of comfort in this terrible war. He could write a new letter, a new promise, a new message to be delivered if he didn't make it home. "Okay, Sarge. I'll send it. Tomorrow when we get to the rear area, I'll send it." "Good man." Carter stared out at the dark water of the Seine. "We've come a long way, Sullivan, from Omaha Beach to here. A lot of miles, a lot of battles, a lot of good men lost. But we're winning. We're actually winning." "Yeah," James agreed, "we're winning." And in that moment, beside the Seine River in the late summer of 1944, James Sullivan allowed himself to hope. Hope that the war would end soon. Hope that he'd survive to see it. Hope that all the sacrifice, all the pain, all the death would mean something in the end. Hope that America's promise of freedom, of justice, of a better world would be fulfilled. Because that's what they'd been fighting for all along. Not glory, not conquest, but the simple promise that people everywhere deserved to live free from tyranny and oppression. It was a promise worth dying for. More than that, it was a promise worth living for, worth carrying forward into whatever future awaited them beyond the war. Tomorrow he would send the letter. Tomorrow he would write a new one. Tomorrow the advance would continue, and with it the long road home. But tonight he could rest. Tonight he could allow himself this small moment of peace beside a French river, in the company of good men, in the service of a cause larger than himself. Tonight, James Sullivan was still alive, still fighting, still embodying everything that made America great. And that, for now, was enough. Paris fell on August 25th, and James Sullivan was there to see it. The liberation of the French capital was unlike anything he'd experienced in the war so far. The fighting had been relatively light. The German commander had defied Hitler's orders to destroy the city, choosing to surrender instead, and the reception from the Parisians was ecstatic. James's company marched down the Champs-Élysées alongside French resistance fighters and regular army units. Millions of people lined the streets, a sea of humanity stretching as far as the eye could see. They cheered, they cried, they sang the Marseillaise and the Star-Spangled Banner. Women ran into the street to kiss the soldiers. Old men pressed bottles of wine into their hands. Children waved flags, French, American, British, a rainbow of liberated nations. For James, it was overwhelming. After the horror of the hedgerows, after Mortain, after so much death and destruction, this celebration of life and freedom felt surreal. He marched with tears streaming down his face, not from sadness, but from the sheer emotional weight of the moment. This was why they'd fought. This was why men had died. To see people free, to see joy return to their faces, to see tyranny defeated and hope restored. Sergeant Carter marched beside him, and James could see the same emotion on his face. "Remember this, Sullivan," Carter said quietly, his voice barely audible over the cheering crowds. "When the nightmares come, when you can't sleep because you're seeing the faces of dead friends, remember this. Remember that it meant something, that we gave these people their lives back." "I'll remember, Sarge." That night, the company was billeted in a hotel that had been emptied of German officers just hours before. Real beds, hot showers, actual food instead of rations. It felt like heaven. James showered for the first time in weeks, washing away layers of dirt and blood and the accumulated grime of months of combat. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. His face was lean and hard, aged far beyond his 22 years. His eyes carried that distant look he'd seen in so many combat veterans. The boy who'd landed on Omaha Beach was gone. In his place was a soldier, a warrior, someone who'd seen the worst of what men could do to each other and survived. He sat on the hotel bed, a real bed with actual sheets, and pulled out 2 pieces of paper. One was the letter he'd written before D-Day, battered but still intact. The other was fresh, requisitioned from the hotel manager. He read the old letter one more time, remembering the fear and uncertainty he'd felt writing it, remembering the boy he'd been. Then he began to write a new one. "Dear Mom, I'm alive. I know that's the most important thing you need to hear, so I'm saying it right up front. I'm alive, I'm relatively healthy, and I'm in Paris. Yes, Paris. I never thought I'd see this city, and certainly not like this, but here I am. The letter I wrote before D-Day. I'm finally sending it, along with this new one. I've carried it over my heart for almost 3 months now, through battles I never could have imagined. It's become a talisman of sorts, a reminder of who I was and who I'm fighting for. I can't tell you everything I've seen and done. Some of it you wouldn't believe, and some of it I hope you never have to know about. War is not what the movies make it out to be. It's not glorious or heroic or any of those things. It's hard and brutal, and it changes you in ways you can't understand until you've lived it. But I can tell you this, what we're doing here matters. Every town we liberate, every family we free from Nazi occupation, every day we push the Germans back, it all matters. Today, I marched through Paris and saw 1 million people celebrating their freedom. I saw children who will grow up without knowing Nazi rule. I saw old men crying because they thought they'd never live to see this day. That's why we're here. That's why we fight. I've lost friends. Good men, brave men, better men than me. They won't be coming home, and their families will get letters that will break their hearts. I think about them every day. Marcus and Daniel and all the others whose names I carry with me. I fight for them now, too, to make sure their sacrifice meant something. Sergeant Carter, I've told you about him in other letters, says that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. I think about that a lot. I'm scared every day, Mom. Scared of dying, scared of failing, scared of letting down the men who depend on me, but I keep going because that's what American soldiers do. We don't quit. Tell Dad I'm using everything he taught me. Those hunting trips in the Maine woods, they prepared me for this more than he knew. Tell Sarah that her letters mean the world to me, that reading about normal life back home helps me remember what we're fighting for. I don't know when this war will end. We're winning. We're definitely winning. But there's still a long road ahead. Germany won't give up easily, and there will be more battles, more losses, more hard days. But we'll see it through. That's the American way. I love you, Mom. I love all of you. And I promise I'll do everything I can to come home safely when this is over. But if I don't make it, know that I died doing something that mattered, fighting for something worth dying for. Your loving son, James. P.S. I was in the same hotel room where Hemingway stayed before the war. I don't know if that means anything, but it felt like something you'd want to know. He folded both letters carefully and addressed an envelope. Tomorrow he'd mail them, send them off to Portland, Maine, to a life and a world that seemed impossibly distant from where he sat now. But that was okay. His mother deserved to know he was alive. She deserved whatever comfort these letters could bring. The next morning, before they moved out, James went to find Eddie Chen. The radio man had become something of a company scribe, helping soldiers write letters home and finding ways to get them through the mail system. "Chen, can you make sure these get sent?" James asked, handing over the envelope. Chen took it, noted the address. "Portland, Maine. Your mom?" "Yeah. Just want her to know I'm okay. I'll get them out today through the chaplain's office. They move faster that way." Chen paused. "You okay, Sullivan? You seem, I don't know, different since Paris." James considered the question. Was he okay? He was alive, uninjured except for minor wounds that had healed. But was he okay? That was harder to answer. "I'm still here," he said finally. "Still fighting. That's about all I can say." "That's enough," Chen replied. "That's all any of us can say." The company moved out that afternoon, heading northeast toward the German border. The liberation of Paris had been a moment of triumph, but the war was far from over. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans were regrouping, preparing to defend their homeland with desperate ferocity. The easy advances of the summer were ending. The hard fighting was about to begin again. They reached the German border in early September. The contrast between France and Germany was stark and immediate. The French had welcomed them as liberators. The Germans, even civilians, regarded them with fear and hostility. Towns were empty, their inhabitants having fled before the advancing Americans. Those who remained watched from shuttered windows, their faces hard and suspicious. "Can't say I blame them," Carter observed, as they passed through a deserted village. "We're the enemy here. Their homes, their country. They don't see us as liberators." "They started this war," one of the replacements said bitterly. "They voted for Hitler. They cheered when he invaded Poland, when he attacked France. Now they want to play the victim?" "It's more complicated than that," James said quietly. "They're people, same as us. Most of them probably just wanted to live their lives, raise their families, be left alone. But they got caught up in something bigger, something evil, and now they're paying the price." "You feeling sorry for them, Sullivan?" James thought about that. Was he? After everything he'd seen, after all the death and destruction the Nazis had caused, did he have any sympathy for German civilians? "No," he said finally, "not sorry. But I understand the difference between soldiers and civilians, between the people who started this war and the ones who just got swept up in it. We're here to defeat Germany, not to punish every German." The fighting intensified as they pushed deeper into German territory. The Wehrmacht was defending its homeland now, and every soldier fought with renewed ferocity. The easy victories of France were over. Now every town, every hill, every river crossing was contested. American casualties mounted steadily. In mid-September, James's company was tasked with taking a fortified town called Aachen, the first major German city to face Allied assault. The battle for Aachen would become one of the bloodiest urban combats of the war, a house-by-house, room-by-room fight that lasted for weeks. James found himself once again fighting in ruined buildings, clearing rooms, watching for snipers, trying to stay alive in an environment where death could come from any direction. The Germans had had years to prepare these defenses, and they'd done their job well. Every building was a fortress, every street was a killing zone. On the 5th day of the battle, James's squad was clearing a large apartment complex when they encountered a German position that stopped them cold. A machine gun nest backed up by infantry with Panzerfausts, positioned to cover the only approach. 3 attempts to take the position had failed, leaving 6 Americans dead and twice that many wounded. Sergeant Carter studied the situation, then looked at James. "I need someone to work around to their flank, get close enough to take out that machine gun. It's a one-man job. Anything more, and we'll be spotted." James knew what Carter was asking. It was a suicide mission, or close enough. But someone had to do it, and he'd always been good at moving quietly, at finding angles others missed. "I'll go, Sarge." "You sure?" James thought about his mother, about the letters he'd sent. He thought about all the reasons to say no, to let someone else take this risk. But he thought about the men depending on him, about the mission that had to be completed, about the duty he'd sworn to uphold. "I'm sure." He moved out alone, crawling through rubble, using bomb craters and fallen walls for cover. It took him 45 minutes to work his way around to the German flank, moving inch by inch, barely breathing, expecting at any moment to be spotted and cut down. But his luck held. The Germans were focused on the direct approach, not watching their flank as carefully as they should have. James got within 20 yards of the machine gun position before being spotted. A German soldier shouted a warning, swinging his rifle toward James. There was no time for careful aim. No time for anything but action. James fired from the hip, dropping the German, then rolled behind cover as the machine gun swung toward him. He pulled his last grenade, cooked it for 2 seconds, then threw it with everything he had. The explosion silenced the machine gun. James was up and running before the smoke cleared, firing as he moved, taking out the remaining Germans before they could react. "Position clear," he shouted. Carter and the others poured through the gap, taking the building in a rush. It was over in minutes, but it had cost them. 2 more men down, including Hayes, who took a round through the lung and died before the medics could reach him. James knelt beside his friend's body, remembering the bar gunner who'd helped him flank that machine gun position back in the hedgerows, who'd fought beside him through countless battles. "Rest easy, brother," James said quietly. "You did your part. You did your country proud." The battle for Aachen continued for another week. When it finally ended, the city was in ruins, and James's company had been reduced to just 18 men from the 80 who'd started. 18 out of 80. The mathematics of war, written in blood and sacrifice. They were pulled out of the line after Aachen, sent to a rear area for rest and refit. James barely remembered the trip. He was so exhausted that he slept through most of it, waking only when someone shook his shoulder to tell him they'd arrived. The rest area was in Belgium, a small town that had been liberated months ago and was relatively untouched by fighting. Real beds, hot food, a chance to sleep without fear of artillery or attack. James should have been grateful, but he found he couldn't relax. Every loud noise made him jump. He couldn't sleep for more than a few hours at a time. When he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of dead friends, heard the screams of wounded men, relived battles that would never truly end. The company chaplain found him one afternoon, sitting alone in a church, staring at nothing. "Mind if I join you, son?" the chaplain asked. James shrugged. The chaplain sat down in the pew beside him, not speaking for a long moment, just sitting in companionable silence. "You've seen a lot," the chaplain said finally. "Done a lot. Fought in battles that will be written about in history books, but I'm not here to talk about glory or heroism. I'm here to ask if you're okay." "I'm alive," James said, the same answer he'd given Chen. "That's not what I asked." James was quiet for a long time, then, "No, I'm not okay. I don't know if I'll ever be okay again. I've killed men, chaplain. A lot of men. I've watched friends die. I've done things that will haunt me for the rest of my life. How am I supposed to be okay with that?" "You're not," the chaplain said simply. "You're not supposed to be okay with it. War isn't something you're meant to be okay with. It's hell, and it scars everyone it touches. Then why do we do it? Why do we keep fighting? Because some things are worth fighting for. Freedom, justice, the simple right of people to live without fear of tyranny. You're fighting so that other people don't have to, so that future generations can grow up in peace. That doesn't make it easy, and it doesn't erase what you've experienced, but it gives it meaning." James thought about that. Meaning. Was that enough? Could meaning compensate for everything he'd lost, everything he'd become? "I wrote a letter to my mother before D-Day," he said. "A goodbye letter, in case I didn't make it. I carried it over my heart through every battle. It reminded me of who I was, of what I was fighting for. Do you still have it?" "No, I sent it home, wrote a new one to go with it. But sometimes I wonder if that person, the one who wrote that first letter, if he still exists. If he survived the war, even if my body did." "He's still in there," the chaplain said. "Changed, yes, scarred, absolutely, but not gone. You're still the man who writes letters to his mother, who saves French families from basements, who risks his life for his brothers. The war has added to who you are, but it hasn't destroyed you, not unless you let it." If you've been following James's journey from Omaha Beach to here, we'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us share these important stories of courage and sacrifice. The chaplain left James alone with his thoughts. And slowly, sitting in that Belgian church, James began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Not back to who he'd been, that was impossible, but forward to who he might become, carrying the weight of war, but not crushed by it. A man who'd faced the worst of humanity and still believed in the best of it. A man who'd kept fighting, kept standing up, kept embodying the American spirit even when it seemed like the whole world was darkness and death. A man who, despite everything, was still alive, still here, still American. And that, for now, would have to be enough. The rest period in Belgium ended too soon, as all rest periods did. By late October, James's company was back in action, part of a major push toward the Rhine River. The weather had turned cold and wet, making every march a misery of mud and chill. The Germans continued to fight fiercely, contesting every mile, making the Allies pay in blood for every yard gained. James had been promoted to corporal after Aachen, a promotion he hadn't wanted but couldn't refuse. With it came more responsibility. More men depending on him, more decisions that could mean life or death. He led a squad now, 8 men whose survival rested partially on his shoulders. It was a weight he carried along with all the others, another layer of pressure on a mind already stretched thin by months of combat. The company was advancing through the Hürtgen forest, a dense woodland that seemed designed by nature to favor the defender. Visibility was limited to a few dozen yards. Artillery couldn't penetrate the thick canopy effectively. Tanks were useless among the closely spaced trees. It was infantry warfare at its most basic and most brutal. Small units fighting small units in the shadows, never knowing if the next tree concealed an enemy soldier. The casualties were horrific. James's company lost men daily to snipers, mines, mortars, and simple exhaustion. Men who'd survived since D-Day went down in these dark woods, their bodies left behind as the advance continued. There was no time for proper burials, no time for anything except moving forward, always forward, toward objectives that seemed to have no meaning except as points on a map. On November 8th, 5 months to the day since D-Day, James's squad was assigned to capture a bunker complex on a ridge overlooking a crucial supply route. Intelligence said the position was lightly defended, that they should be able to take it with minimal casualties. James had learned not to trust intelligence assessments. They were wrong more often than they were right, but orders were orders. They approached the bunker complex at dawn, moving carefully through the morning mist. James had point, as usual, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Birds didn't sing, small animals didn't rustle in the undergrowth. It was the kind of silence that preceded violence, and James felt his stomach tighten. The attack came without warning. The lightly defended position erupted with machine gun and rifle fire from multiple directions. It was an ambush, carefully planned and perfectly executed. The Germans had known they were coming, had prepared the killing ground, and now they sprung the trap. James's squad hit the ground, returning fire, trying to locate the enemy positions through the mist and smoke. Men went down immediately. Harper took a round through the throat, Murphy was hit in the chest, Williams lost half his face to machine gun fire. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire and screaming. "Pull back!" James screamed. "Fall back to the tree line!" They retreated under fire, dragging their wounded when they could, leaving the dead when they couldn't. James was the last one out, laying down covering fire with his M1, burning through ammunition, giving his men time to escape the killing zone. A bullet grazed his helmet. Another tore through his jacket without hitting flesh. His luck was holding, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. They regrouped in a small depression in the ground, what remained of the squad. Just 5 men out of 8, and 2 of those were wounded. Corporal James Sullivan, Private First Class Eddie Chen, who'd been transferred to James's squad after his radioman skills weren't needed following a breakdown in equipment, and 3 replacements who'd joined just a week ago and whose names James was only beginning to learn. "We need to report this," Chen said, breathing hard. "That position is way stronger than intel said. They need to hit it with artillery before sending anyone else in." "Radio's back with the company," James replied. "We'll have to go back on foot to report." They made their way back through the forest, moving slowly, watching for German patrols. It took 3 hours to cover 2 miles. When they finally reached the company position, they found it in chaos. While James's squad had been attacking the bunker, the Germans had launched a counterattack on the company's position. The fighting was still going on, a confused melee in the trees where it was hard to tell friend from enemy. James didn't hesitate. He plunged into the fight, his squad following, adding their rifles to the defense. The battle was close and vicious, sometimes fought hand to hand when soldiers ran out of ammunition or were too close to shoot. James found himself grappling with a German soldier, both of them fighting for a knife, rolling in the mud and fallen leaves. James won, but only barely, and he didn't have time to think about what he'd just done before another enemy soldier was on him. The German counterattack was finally beaten back, but at a terrible cost. The company had lost nearly half its remaining strength. Sergeant Carter was among the wounded. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his leg, and he was being evacuated to a field hospital. Before they took him away, he called James over. "Sullivan, you're in charge now. You're the ranking NCO who isn't wounded." Carter gripped James's hand tight. "Take care of the men. Get them through this. That's all you can do. Just get them through." "I will, Sarge. I promise." "I know you will. You're a good soldier, James, one of the best I've served with. Your country should be proud of you." They took Carter away on a stretcher, and James found himself in command of what remained of the company. 32 men, all that was left of the unit that had landed on Omaha Beach with nearly 200. The weight of command settled on his shoulders like a physical thing, heavy and inescapable. The next 2 weeks in the Hürtgen forest were among the worst of the war. The fighting was constant, the casualties unrelenting. Men died from enemy fire, from cold and exposure, from wounds that festered and turned septic in the wet conditions. The forest itself seemed to be fighting against them, with its mud that sucked at boots, its darkness that bred fear and paranoia, its endless trees that all looked the same until soldiers got lost and stumbled into German positions. James led his men through it all, making decisions that saved some lives and cost others, living with the knowledge that every order he gave could result in a soldier's death. He aged years in those 2 weeks, his face becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed, his movements mechanical and exhausted. He was running on empty, held together by duty and the knowledge that his men depended on him. On November 22nd, the company, what was left of it, was finally pulled out of the Hürtgen forest. They'd accomplished their objectives, taken their piece of ground, paid the price in blood. But the cost had been astronomical. Of the 32 men James had commanded at the start, only 14 walked out of those woods. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. They were sent to a rest area in France, a small town where they could recover, integrate replacements, and prepare for the next operation. James found himself in a quiet room in a farmhouse, alone for the first time in weeks. He sat on the bed, still in his muddy uniform, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd been through. So many dead, so many faces he'd never see again, so many names he'd have to remember for the rest of his life, carrying them like stones in his heart. The burden of command was heavier than he'd ever imagined, and he understood now why Carter had looked so haunted from the first day they'd met. A knock on the door interrupted his dark thoughts. It was Eddie Chen, carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. Real coffee, not the reconstituted powder they usually drank. "Thought you might need this," Chen said, handing 1 cup to James. "Thanks." They sat in silence for a while, drinking the coffee, not needing words. Chen had been there for all of it, had seen everything James had seen. They understood each other in a way that only combat veterans could. "You did good in there," Chen said finally, "in the forest. You kept us alive when anyone else would have gotten us killed. Not all of us, James replied bitterly. 18 men dead. That's not doing good. That's war. You can't save everyone. All you can do is make the best decisions you can with the information you have, and hope it's enough. You did that. You kept faith with the men who depended on you. That's all any leader can do. James wanted to believe that, but the faces of the dead haunted him. Harper, Murphy, Williams, and all the others. He'd given the orders that had sent them into danger. He'd made the decisions that had cost them their lives. How was he supposed to live with that? I wrote a letter once, he said quietly, before D-Day. Told my mother that I wasn't a hero, just a kid from Portland doing his part. But now I don't even know what I am anymore. I've killed men, Chen, a lot of men. I've sent men to die. I've made choices that haunt me every night. What does that make me? Human, Chen replied simply. It makes you human. Heroes aren't people who don't feel the weight of what they do. Heroes are people who feel it and do it anyway because it needs to be done. You're carrying that weight, James. I can see it on your face, in your eyes, but you're still here, still leading, still doing your duty. That's what makes you a hero, even if you can't see it yourself. They finished their coffee in silence. Outside, the sound of men talking and laughing drifted through the window, survivors celebrating the simple fact that they were still alive. James envied them that ability to find joy, but he understood it too. You took happiness where you could find it in war, because tomorrow might bring death. That night, James wrote another letter home. Not a goodbye letter this time, but an update, a way of letting his family know he was still alive, still fighting. The words came slowly, each sentence a struggle, because how could he explain what he'd become, what he'd seen, what the war had made him? Dear Mom, I'm alive, though sometimes I'm not sure how. We've been through some hard fighting recently. I can't tell you where or what exactly, but it was bad, worse than anything since D-Day. But we made it through, and I'm writing to let you know I'm okay. I've been promoted again. I'm a corporal now, leading a squad, making decisions that affect other men's lives. It's a responsibility I never wanted but can't refuse. Every day I have to make choices that might get someone killed, and every night I lie awake thinking about whether I made the right ones. The war has changed me, Mom. I won't lie to you about that. I'm not the same person who left Portland. I've seen things, done things that I'll carry with me forever. But I'm still trying to be the son you raised, the man Dad taught me to be. I'm still trying to do what's right, even when the right thing is hard to see through all the smoke and blood. We're winning. I want you to know that. All the sacrifice, all the death, it's not for nothing. We're pushing the Germans back, liberating Europe, ending the Nazi regime. Every day brings us closer to victory, closer to the day when I can come home and put all this behind me. I think about home a lot. About the smell of pine trees and salt air, about Dad's workshop and Sarah's laugh and your cooking, about fishing on the lake and hiking in the woods and all the normal things that seem so precious now that I know how easily they can be lost. When this is over, if I make it through, I want to appreciate every moment of normal life, every sunrise, every meal, every day of peace. Tell everyone I love them. Tell them I'm doing my best to come home safely. And tell them that what we're doing here matters, that American soldiers are fighting and dying for something bigger than ourselves, for ideals that transcend borders and nations, freedom, justice, the simple right of people to live without fear. That's what makes us American, Mom. Not our strength or our weapons, but our willingness to fight for those ideals, even when it costs us everything. I'm proud to be part of that, even as I carry the weight of what it's required of me. I'll write again when I can. Until then, know that I'm okay, I'm doing my duty, and I'm thinking of home. Your loving son, James. He sealed the letter and set it aside to be mailed the next day. Then he lay back on the bed, still in his uniform, and tried to sleep. The nightmares came, as they always did, visions of the Hurtgen forest, of men dying, of decisions made and consequences paid. But he'd learned to live with the nightmares, to accept them as the price of survival. Outside, the war continued. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges, new tests of courage and endurance. But tonight, James Sullivan was alive. Tonight, he could rest. And tomorrow, when the time came, he'd stand up again, lead his men again, do his duty again. Because that's what American soldiers did. They stood up, they fought on. They paid the price of freedom with their blood and their sacrifice. And they never, ever gave up. The rest period lasted 10 days, longer than James had expected, but needed desperately by men who'd been pushed to the breaking point in the Hurtgen forest. During that time, replacements arrived to fill out the depleted ranks. James found himself training new soldiers, trying to give them the knowledge that might keep them alive in their first battle. It was difficult work, knowing that some of them, maybe most of them, would be dead within weeks or days. One of the replacements, a kid from Wisconsin named Thomas Mitchell, reminded James of Tommy Reeves, the 17-year-old who'd been wounded on D-Day. Mitchell had the same eager expression, the same desire to prove himself, the same innocent belief that courage and determination would see him through. James tried to temper that enthusiasm with reality, but he knew the kid wouldn't truly understand until he'd experienced combat himself. "Stay close to the veterans," James told Mitchell and the other replacements during a training session. "Watch what they do, follow their lead. Don't try to be a hero, just do your job and stay alive. That's all anyone expects of you." "Yes, Corporal," they chorused, but James could see in their eyes that they didn't really understand. How could they? War wasn't something you could explain. It had to be experienced. And by the time they understood what James was trying to teach them, it might be too late. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. It was a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, designed to split the Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. The initial assault hit American units that were resting or newly arrived in the area, causing chaos and confusion along a 50-mile front. James's company was part of the General Reserve, and within hours of the attack beginning, they were loaded onto trucks and rushed north toward the Ardennes. The mood in the trucks was tense. The men had heard rumors of the German attack, of American units being overrun, of entire battalions surrounded and cut off. After months of advancing, of winning, suddenly they were on the defensive again, rushing to plug a hole in the line before it became a catastrophe. The truck convoy moved through the night, headlights off to avoid German aircraft, navigating by moonlight and the faint glow of burning villages on the horizon. James sat with his squad, checking weapons, distributing ammunition, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. The truth was, nobody knew what they were driving into. The situation was confused, communications were spotty, and command seemed to be making decisions based on incomplete information. They arrived at a small Belgian town called Bastogne, just as dawn was breaking on December 19th. The town was chaos. Wounded soldiers streaming back from the front, supply trucks trying to get forward, military police attempting to direct traffic, and over it all, the sound of artillery getting steadily closer. The Germans were coming, and Bastogne sat at a crucial road junction that could determine the outcome of the entire battle. James's company was assigned to defensive positions on the northeastern edge of town. They dug foxholes in the frozen ground. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the ground was like iron, and prepared to hold against whatever the Germans threw at them. Intelligence said German armor was approaching, supported by infantry. The Americans had anti-tank weapons, but not many, and air support was grounded by terrible weather. It was going to be a ground fight. infantry and tanks, and the odds didn't favor the defenders. The first German probe came that afternoon, infantry supported by 2 Panzer IVs, testing the American defenses. James's squad held their fire until the Germans were close, then opened up with everything they had. The fight was brief but intense. One of the tanks was knocked out by a bazooka team, the other withdrew, and the infantry fell back after taking casualties. But it was just a probe. The real attack would come later. That night, the temperature dropped to near 0. James and his men huddled in their foxholes, trying to stay warm, knowing that sleep could mean death from exposure. Some men had winter gear, but most didn't. The supply situation was desperate, with German advances having cut off supply routes. They burned whatever they could find for warmth, shared blankets, and tried to keep each other awake through the long, bitter night. Thomas Mitchell, the replacement who reminded James of Tommy Reeves, was in the foxhole next to James's. The kid was shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so hard James could hear it from several feet away. "Mitchell, you okay?" James called softly. "Cold, Corporal. Never been this cold in my life." "I know, but you stay awake, you hear me? You fall asleep in this cold, you might not wake up. Talk to me. Tell me about home." "We're Wisconsin, family farm. We raised dairy cows." Mitchell's voice was weak, but he was talking, staying conscious. "Always thought the winters there were cold, but this is different. Tell me about the farm. What's it like?" Mitchell talked through the night, his voice growing stronger as he focused on memories of home rather than his current misery. He talked about milking cows at dawn, about his younger sisters, about Friday night dances at the town hall, about a girl named Susan who'd promised to wait for him. James listened, occasionally prompting Mitchell with questions, keeping the kid engaged, keeping him alive through that frozen night. When dawn finally came, James could see his breath in the air like fog. Every movement was stiff and painful, his joints frozen, his fingers barely functional. Around him other men stirred slowly, emerging from foxholes like creatures from hibernation. Some didn't emerge at all. They'd frozen to death during the night, died without a shot being fired. The German attack came at 800, preceded by an artillery barrage that tore up the frozen ground and shattered what few buildings remained intact in this sector. Then came the tanks, Panthers and Tigers this time, heavy armor that American weapons struggled to penetrate. Behind the tanks marched German infantry in their grey-green uniforms, veterans who knew their business. James's squad opened fire, targeting the infantry, while the bazooka teams went after the tanks. The noise was deafening, the air filled with the smell of cordite and burning metal. A Tiger tank's 80 Militus gun fired, and the shell obliterated a foxhole 30 yards from James, killing everyone in it instantly. Another tank was brewing up, struck by a lucky bazooka shot, its crew bailing out only to be cut down by rifle fire. The battle raged for hours. Waves of German infantry came forward, were beaten back, reformed, and came again. American positions were overrun, then retaken in desperate counterattacks. Men fought until their weapons ran dry, then fought with captured German weapons, then with knives and entrenching tools when the ammunition ran out completely. James found himself in command of not just his squad, but an entire platoon. The lieutenant had been killed in the first minutes of the battle, and James was the senior NCO who was still alive and unwounded. He moved from position to position, directing fire, shifting men to plug gaps in the line, doing whatever needed to be done to hold the position. At one point, a Panther tank broke through the American line and was advancing toward the town itself. James grabbed a bazooka from a dead soldier and ran toward the tank, knowing he had to stop it before it reached the town center where wounded were being treated. He got within 50 yards before the tank spotted him and began to traverse its turret. It was a race. Could he get close enough to shoot before the tank's gun could bear on him? He fired at 30 yards, the backblast from the bazooka nearly knocking him down. The rocket streaked toward the tank and struck its side armor. For a moment, nothing happened, and James thought he'd missed or the round had failed to penetrate. Then smoke began pouring from the tank's hatches, and the crew was bailing out. James shot one, then another, feeling nothing, his actions mechanical, his humanity temporarily suspended in the interest of survival. When the day finally ended, the Americans still held Bastogne, barely. They'd given up ground, lost men, expended precious ammunition and supplies. But they'd held. The Germans hadn't broken through. That night, the temperature dropped even further. Supply trucks tried to reach the town, but were turned back by German positions that now surrounded Bastogne on 3 sides. The Americans were cut off, surrounded, running low on everything. Medical supplies were critically short. Wounded men lay in aid stations with minimal treatment, their groans audible throughout the night. Food was rationed to 1 meal per day. Ammunition was carefully conserved, with every bullet counting. On December 22nd, German envoys approached under a white flag with a surrender demand. The message was delivered to the American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, who sent back a one-word reply, "Nuts." The response became legendary, a symbol of American defiance in the face of impossible odds. When word of the general's response filtered down to the troops, James heard men actually laughing for the first time in days. It was the kind of ridiculous, magnificent gesture that embodied the American spirit. We're surrounded, we're freezing, we're running out of everything, but we're not quitting. Nuts to you and nuts to anyone who thinks we'll surrender. The siege continued, days blurred together into a continuous cycle of combat, cold and hunger. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. Others died from exposure, their bodies simply giving up in the brutal cold. The survivors became gaunt and hollow-eyed, sustained only by determination and the knowledge that giving up meant death or capture. Thomas Mitchell was hit on December 23rd, a piece of shrapnel from a mortar round tearing into his abdomen. James dragged him to an aid station, but the medics could do little. They'd run out of morphine, run out of proper bandages, run out of almost everything. Mitchell died that night, calling for his mother and for Susan, the girl back in Wisconsin who'd promised to wait for him. James knelt beside the kid's body, feeling the familiar rage and grief wash over him. Another one. Another name to add to the list. Another face to haunt his dreams. Mitchell had never gotten a chance to become a veteran, to learn the lessons that might have kept him alive. He'd lasted less than a week in combat, died in a frozen Belgian town whose name he probably couldn't pronounce, thousands of miles from the farm and the girl he'd loved. "I'm sorry," James said quietly to the dead boy. "I tried to keep you alive. I tried to teach you. But it wasn't enough. It's never enough." Eddie Chen found James there an hour later, still kneeling beside Mitchell's body. "Come on, James. There's nothing more you can do for him. The living need you." "How many more, Eddie? How many more kids are going to die before this is over?" "I don't know, but we keep going because that's all we can do. We keep fighting, keep surviving, keep doing our duty. That's what Mitchell would want. That's what all of them would want." James stood slowly, his joints protesting, his body pushed beyond exhaustion. Chen was right. The living needed him. There would be time for grief later, if there was a later. For now, he had to keep going. On December 26th, the weather finally cleared. American fighter bombers filled the sky, striking German positions, dropping supplies to the surrounded garrison. And from the south came the sound of tank engines, American tanks, Patton's Third Army, smashing through the German lines to relieve Bastogne. When the first Sherman tanks rolled into town, the defenders cheered, many of them crying openly. They'd held. Against all odds, against impossible conditions, they'd held. The siege of Bastogne was over. James watched the relief column arrive, feeling nothing. No joy, no relief, just a vast emptiness. He'd survived again, but at what cost? So many dead, so many good men who'd never see another sunrise, never go home, never live the lives they'd been promised. The company, what remained of it, was evacuated from Bastogne the next day. Of the 80 men who'd arrived on December 19th, only 22 were still combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or so broken by cold and exhaustion that they had to be hospitalized. 22 out of 80. The mathematics of war, written again in American blood. They were sent to a rear area hospital for treatment and recovery. James was diagnosed with severe exhaustion, frostbite on his feet and hands, and what the doctors called combat fatigue, a polite term for a mind pushed beyond its limits. They wanted to evacuate him back to England for extended treatment, but he refused. His men were still fighting. His country still needed him. He couldn't quit now, not when the war was still going on. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital, regaining his strength, receiving treatment for his frostbite. During that time, he learned that Sergeant Carter had recovered from his wounds and been promoted to lieutenant. Carter visited James in the hospital, and the two men who'd shared so much sat together without speaking for a long time. "They want to give you the Silver Star," Carter said finally, "for Bastogne, for knocking out that tank, for holding the line, for all of it." "I don't want it," James replied. "Give it to Mitchell. Give it to all the kids who died there. They're the heroes, not me." "You're still carrying that weight, aren't you? Still blaming yourself for every man who dies under your command." "Shouldn't I? I'm the one giving the orders. I'm the one deciding who goes where, who takes point, who clears the building. Every decision I make, someone might die because of it. And if you don't make those decisions, everyone might die. That's leadership, James. It's not about making choices that keep everyone alive. That's impossible. It's about making the best choices you can with the information you have and living with the consequences. You've done that. You've done it better than most. Your men trust you because they know you'll never ask them to do something you wouldn't do yourself." James wanted to believe that, but the faces of the dead haunted him. Harper, Murphy, Williams, Mitchell, and dozens of others whose names he carried like stones. "How do you live with it?" he asked. "How do you keep going when you know that more men are going to die, that you're going to have to make more decisions that get people killed?" "You focus on why we're fighting," Carter said, "on what we're fighting for. Freedom, liberty, the American dream. You remember that every man who dies, dies for something bigger than himself. That doesn't make it hurt less, but it gives it meaning. And meaning is all we have." James was released from the hospital in mid-January. The Battle of the Bulge was ending, the German offensive defeated, and the Allies were preparing to resume their advance toward Germany. He rejoined his unit, now commanded by Lieutenant Carter, and found himself promoted to sergeant. More responsibility, more men depending on him, more weight on shoulders already burdened. The winter offensive continued through January and February. The fighting was brutal, the weather terrible, the casualties mounting steadily. But the Americans kept pushing forward, kept taking ground, kept driving the Germans back. Every day brought them closer to Germany, closer to Berlin, closer to the end. In early March, the company reached the Rhine River, the last major barrier between the Allies and the heart of Germany. The Germans had blown most of the bridges, but at a town called Remagen, one bridge still stood. American forces seized it in a desperate rush, and suddenly the Allies had a foothold on the eastern bank of the Rhine. James's company crossed the Rhine on March 10th, part of the flood of American troops pouring into Germany. The end was in sight now. The Germans were falling back on all fronts, their armies crumbling, their cities burning. It was just a matter of time, but the Germans weren't finished yet. They fought on with desperate ferocity, making the Allies pay for every mile, every town, every river crossing. And American soldiers kept dying, kept paying the price of victory with their blood, even as the war entered its final weeks. On April 12th, word spread through the ranks that President Roosevelt had died. James heard the news and felt something inside him break. Roosevelt had led America through the Depression and the war, had been the voice on the radio giving fireside chats, had been the symbol of American resolve. And now he was gone, dead, before he could see the victory he'd worked so hard to achieve. James thought about all the other men who wouldn't see victory. Marcus Johnson, dying to clear a path on Omaha Beach. Robert Hayes, shot through the lung in Aachen. Thomas Mitchell, calling for his mother in a frozen Belgian town. Thousands upon thousands of American soldiers who'd given everything for a victory they'd never witness. "We'll finish it for them," Eddie Chen said quietly, standing beside James as they absorbed the news. "For Roosevelt, for all the ones who didn't make it. We'll see this through to the end." "Yeah," James agreed, "we'll finish it." The advance continued. American and Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from opposite directions, squeezing what remained of the Third Reich between them. The German army was disintegrating, with entire units surrendering without a fight. But some still resisted, still fought, still killed American soldiers who'd survived years of war, only to die in its final days. On April 25th, American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River. The link-up was celebrated, soldiers from both armies embracing, sharing cigarettes and vodka, marveling that they'd survived to see this moment. James watched the celebrations with a distant sense of unreality. Was it really almost over? After all the death, all the destruction, all the sacrifice, was the war finally ending? Word came on May 7th that Germany had surrendered. Unconditional surrender, exactly what the Allies had demanded. The war in Europe was over. Victory had been achieved. James heard the news and felt nothing. No joy, no relief, no sense of triumph, just emptiness. He'd survived. He'd made it through D-Day, through the hedgerows, through Aachen and the Hürtgen forest, and Bastogne and the Rhine crossing and all the rest. He'd survived when so many others hadn't, and now it was over. Men around him were celebrating, drinking, laughing, crying with relief. But James just sat alone, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of everything he'd experienced, everything he'd done, everyone he'd lost. The war was over, but its effects would last forever. Lieutenant Carter found him there, as he'd found him so many times before. The officer sat down beside him, not speaking for a long moment. "It's over, James. We won. You can go home now." "Home," James repeated. "I don't even know what that means anymore." "The person who left Portland, he's gone, sir. The war killed him as surely as it killed all the others. I don't know who I am now, or how to be anything other than a soldier." "You'll figure it out." "It won't be easy. Nothing about this has been easy, but you'll find your way back. You'll rebuild yourself piece by piece, and someday you'll wake up and realize you've become a whole person again, different than before, carrying scars that will never fully heal, but whole." "How can you be sure?" "Because you're strong. Because you've already survived things that would have broken most men. Because you're an American, and Americans don't quit. We keep going. Keep fighting, keep rebuilding, no matter how hard it gets." James pulled out his wallet and removed a piece of paper, the letter he'd written before D-Day, the one he'd sent home and then been returned to him by his mother with a note saying she wanted him to keep it as a reminder of the man he'd been. He read his own words, written by someone who seemed like a stranger now. "I'm not a hero, Mom. I'm just a kid from Portland who wanted to do his part." Was that still true? He'd done so much more than his part. He'd fought in battles that would be written about in history books. He'd saved lives and taken lives. He'd led men through hell and watched them die despite his best efforts. He'd become someone he never imagined becoming, a warrior, a leader, a survivor of the worst that humanity could inflict. "Maybe I'm not that kid anymore," James said quietly. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe the man I've become, the soldier who stood up when it mattered, who kept fighting when others couldn't, who paid the price of freedom with his own blood and soul, maybe he's worth something too." "He's worth everything," Carter said. "You're a hero, James Sullivan. Not because you're fearless, but because you were afraid and did it anyway. Not because you enjoyed war, but because you hated it and fought anyway. You're everything America should be proud of. Courage in the face of fear, determination in the face of adversity, humanity in the face of horror." James folded the letter carefully and put it back in his wallet. Then he stood, looking out at the German countryside that would no longer be a battlefield, at soldiers who would no longer have to fight, at a world that would rebuild from the ashes of war. "Let's go home, sir. Let's go back to America and try to remember what peace feels like." "Yeah," Carter agreed. "Let's go home." The journey home began in late May, as American forces started the slow process of demobilization. James's company was moved to a processing center in France, where they went through medical examinations, debriefings, and the endless paperwork required to transform soldiers back into civilians. It was a strange, disorienting experience after years of military life, suddenly filling out forms instead of fighting, standing in lines instead of storming positions, worrying about discharge papers instead of enemy bullets. During the processing, James learned he'd been awarded the Silver Star for his actions at Bastogne, the Bronze Star with V device for valor at Aachen, and the Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters for his wounds. There was talk of recommending him for the Distinguished Service Cross, but James asked that the recommendation be withdrawn. He didn't want medals. He wanted to forget, though he knew he never would. He wrote one final letter home, telling his family he was coming back, that he'd survived, that the war was over. The words came easier this time, though he still struggled to express what he'd experienced, what he'd become. "Dear Mom, Dad, and Sarah, I'm coming home. I can barely believe I'm writing those words, but it's true. The war is over, and I'm coming home. I'm not the same person who left Portland. I want to be honest about that. I've seen things and done things that have changed me forever. I've lost friends, watched men die, killed enemies, and made decisions that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The boy you said goodbye to, he's gone. In his place is a man who's older than his years, who carries scars both visible and invisible, who knows the true cost of freedom. But I'm still your son. I still love you. I still remember who I was, and with your help, maybe I can find my way back to something resembling that person. It won't be easy. There will be nightmares and difficult days and moments when the weight of memory seems too heavy to bear. But I'll face those challenges the way I faced the war, one day at a time, with courage and determination, never giving up. I want you to know that what we did over here mattered. Every battle we fought, every town we liberated, every day we pushed the Nazis back, it all mattered. We saved Europe from tyranny. We stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. We proved that America means what it says about freedom and justice and liberty for all. The price was terrible. So many good men died. Marcus Johnson, who I've written about before, Robert Hayes, Tommy Reeves, Thomas Mitchell, and thousands of others whose names I carry in my heart. They paid the ultimate price so that others could be free. I owe it to them to live a good life, to make their sacrifice mean something, to never forget what they gave. I'm bringing home a letter I wrote before D-Day. You sent it back to me, and I've carried it through every battle. It reminds me of who I was, of the promises I made, of the values that made me a soldier. I'm also bringing home memories, both good and bad. And I'm bringing home the knowledge that I served my country with honor, that I stood up when it mattered, that I did my duty. I don't know when exactly I'll arrive. The army moves slowly, and there are thousands of us trying to get home. But I'll be there as soon as I can. Until then, know that I love you all, that I've missed you every day, and that the thought of home is what kept me going through the darkest times. Your son, James. He mailed the letter and then joined the other soldiers waiting for transport. The mood was jubilant. Men who'd survived the war were going home to families, to sweethearts, to lives interrupted by war, and now resuming. They sang songs, played cards, told stories, and made plans for futures that had seemed impossible just months ago. Eddie Chen was heading back to San Francisco, planning to use the GI Bill to go to college. Going to study engineering, he told James. Build things instead of destroying them. Make something positive out of all this. Lieutenant Carter was returning to Ohio, to the wife and daughters he hadn't seen in 3 years. They've grown up without me, he said quietly. My youngest won't even remember me, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it up to them, being the father and husband they deserve. For James, the future was less certain. He'd go back to Portland. But then what? He'd had plans before the war. Maybe go to college, maybe work in his father's business, maybe just live a simple life in his hometown. But those plans seemed impossibly distant now, made by someone he no longer was. The journey home took 3 weeks, first by train across France to the port at Le Havre, then by ship across the Atlantic. James stood at the rail as they departed Europe, watching the coastline recede into the distance. So much death, so much destruction on that continent, but also hope. The people were free now, rebuilding, starting over. In France and Belgium and all the liberated countries, children were growing up without Nazi occupation, families were reuniting, life was beginning again. It had been worth it. Whatever personal cost he'd paid, whatever scars he'd carry, it had been worth it to give those people their freedom back. The Atlantic crossing was smooth, the weather fair. James spent much of the voyage on deck, staring at the ocean, lost in thought. Other soldiers tried to draw him into their celebrations, but he couldn't match their enthusiasm. He was going home, yes, but to what? To a life he no longer fit into? To people who couldn't understand what he'd experienced. The nights filled with nightmares and days haunted by memory. On June 15, 1945, the ship entered New York Harbor. As the Statue of Liberty came into view, grown men wept. For James, seeing Lady Liberty through the morning mist felt like a dream. The war was truly over. He was truly home. He'd truly survived. The reception in New York was overwhelming. Crowds lined the docks, cheering, waving flags, holding signs welcoming home their heroes. Bands played patriotic songs. Girls in Red Cross uniforms handed out coffee and donuts. It was everything James had imagined and nothing like he'd expected. He processed through the reception center, received his discharge papers, collected his final pay, and was issued a suit of civilian clothes to replace his uniform. The transformation was complete. Sergeant James Sullivan, veteran of the European theater, was now just James Sullivan, civilian, free to go wherever he chose. He chose Portland, Maine. The train journey north took 2 days. James sat by the window, watching America pass by, cities and farms, mountains and rivers, the vast, beautiful country he'd fought to defend. It looked the same as he remembered, unchanged by the war that had changed him so profoundly. People went about their lives, working and laughing and living, most of them untouched by the horror that had consumed Europe. That was good, James told himself. That's what he'd fought for. so that America could remain free, so that people could live their lives without fear, so that the darkness that had engulfed Europe would never reach these shores. The fact that most Americans didn't understand what the war had really been like, that was a gift, not a burden. They'd been spared, and he'd helped spare them. The train pulled into Portland Station on the evening of June 17th. James gathered his duffel bag, everything he owned fit in one bag now, and stepped onto the platform, and there they were, his mother, his father, his sister Sarah, all of them standing together, scanning the crowd of returning soldiers, looking for him. His mother saw him first. She screamed his name and ran toward him, and suddenly James was wrapped in her embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume, feeling her tears on his cheek. His father was there, gripping his hand and pulling him into a hug, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah was crying and laughing simultaneously, punching his arm and hugging him alternately. "You're home," his mother kept saying. "You're home. You're safe. You're home." "I'm home," James agreed, and for the first time since the war ended, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt love, felt connection, felt the first stirrings of hope that maybe, possibly, he could find his way back to being human again. They drove to the house on Maple Street, and James sat in the back seat of his father's car, listening to his family talk, watching the familiar streets of Portland pass by. Nothing had changed here. The same houses, the same trees, the same stores and churches and parks. It was as if the war had never happened, as if he'd just been away on a trip and was now returning to resume his normal life. But he had changed. He was different in ways that would take years to fully understand, carrying wounds that would never fully heal, haunted by memories that would never fade. The question was whether he could bridge that gap, whether the man he'd become could find a place in the world he'd left behind. His mother had prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, apple pie for dessert. The entire family sat around the kitchen table, and for a while James let himself pretend that everything was normal, that he was just home from a long journey, that the war had been a bad dream. But then his father asked about his experiences, and James found he couldn't talk about them. How could he explain Omaha Beach to people who'd never seen combat? How could he describe the Hurtgen Forest or Bastogne or any of the rest of it? The words wouldn't come, and even if they did, they wouldn't convey the reality of what he'd experienced. "It was hard," he said finally, "but we did what needed to be done. That's all I can really say about it." His family respected his silence, but James could see the questions in their eyes, the desire to understand what he'd been through. Maybe someday he'd be able to tell them. Maybe someday the memories would be distant enough that he could put them into words. But not tonight. Tonight he just wanted to be home, to be safe, to be surrounded by people who loved him. That night, sleeping in his childhood bed for the first time in 3 years, the nightmares came. James woke at 3 a.m., gasping, covered in sweat, seeing the faces of dead men, hearing the sound of artillery, feeling the cold of Bastogne. He sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, trying to remember where he was, trying to separate past from present. His mother appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a robe, concern on her face. "James, are you okay?" "Just a bad dream, Mom. I'm fine." "You're not fine. Don't lie to me." She sat down beside him, put her arm around his shoulders like she had when he was a child. "Tell me what you need. Tell me how I can help." "I don't know," James admitted. "I don't know how to be home. I don't know how to be normal again. Everything here is the same, but I'm different, and I don't know how to bridge that gap." "You don't have to do it alone. We're here for you, whatever you need, however long it takes. You're not a soldier anymore, James. You're our son, and you're home, and we're going to help you find your way back to yourself." James leaned into her embrace, letting himself be comforted like a child, letting himself acknowledge that he wasn't okay, that he needed help, that the war had broken something inside him that wouldn't heal quickly or easily. "It's going to take time," she said softly. "But time is something you have now. You survived the war. You made it home. Everything else, we'll figure it out together." The days became weeks, and slowly, painfully, James began to adjust to civilian life. He took walks through the town, reacquainting himself with places he'd known all his life. He visited the library where Sarah worked, sat in the park where he'd played as a child, went fishing with his father on the lake where they'd spent so many summer days. He attended the local VFW, where other veterans gathered to share stories and support each other. For the first time, James found he could talk about his experiences, not the details, but the feelings, the struggles, the difficulty of readjusting to normal life. Other men understood because they'd been through the same thing. They'd all come home changed, all struggled to reconnect with a world that hadn't experienced what they had. In August, James used his GI Bill benefits to enroll at the University of Maine. He didn't know what he wanted to study. The future still seemed unclear, but he knew he needed purpose, needed something to work toward. He chose history as his major, wanting to understand the war he'd fought in, to place his experiences in a larger context, to make sense of what he'd been through. One September afternoon, James was walking across campus when he saw a girl. Dark hair, bright eyes, a smile that reminded him of home. Her name was Catherine, and she was studying education, planning to become a teacher. They started talking, and somehow the conversation lasted hours, ranging from books to music to dreams for the future. Catherine didn't press him about the war. She didn't treat him like a hero or a victim. She just treated him like a person, like someone worth knowing for who he was now, rather than what he'd done. And slowly, carefully, James began to open up to her, to share pieces of his story, to let someone into the guarded space he'd built around his heart. By Christmas, they were dating seriously. By the following summer, James asked her to marry him. She said yes, and for the first time since the war ended, James allowed himself to think about the future, not with fear or uncertainty, but with hope. They married in the fall of 1946, a small ceremony in the church James had attended as a child. Lieutenant Carter came up from Ohio to stand as his best man, and Eddie Chen traveled from California to attend. The three veterans stood together, older and scarier than they should have been at their ages, but alive, surviving, building new lives from the ashes of war. At the reception, Carter gave a toast to James Sullivan, who exemplifies everything that's great about America. He stood up when his country needed him. He fought with courage and honor. He came home and rebuilt his life. He's a hero, though he'll never admit it. But more than that, he's a good man, and the world is better because he's in it. To James and Catherine, may you have a long and happy life together. James stood to respond, and for the first time, he found words for what he'd experienced, for what he'd become, for what it all meant. "I'm not a hero," he said, echoing the letter he'd written before D-Day. "I'm just a guy from Portland who did his duty. But I learned something during the war, something I want to share with all of you tonight. America isn't just a place. It's an idea, a promise, a commitment to ideals that transcend borders and nations. Freedom, justice, the belief that all people deserve to live without fear of tyranny or oppression. I fought for that promise. So did thousands of other men, many of whom didn't make it home. They paid the ultimate price so that we could stand here tonight in peace, celebrating love and life and all the good things that make life worth living. I carry their memory with me every day, and I owe it to them to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to love my wife, raise a family, contribute to my community, and try every day to be the kind of person those men died believing Americans could be. That's not heroism. That's just being human, being American, being part of something bigger than myself. To America, to freedom, to all those who paid the price, and to the future. May it be everything they fought for, and more. The wedding guests raised their glasses, and James raised his, looking around at the faces of family and friends, at Catherine standing beside him, at Carter and Chen representing all the brothers in arms he'd fought beside. The war would always be part of him, would always shape who he was, but it didn't have to define him. He could build a new life, create new memories, become someone more than just a soldier. The years passed. James graduated from college, became a teacher, had children who grew up hearing stories about their grandfather's service, but also about kindness, courage, and standing up for what's right. He never talked about the details of combat, never glorified war, but he did teach his children and his students about the importance of defending freedom, of standing up against tyranny, of doing what's right, even when it's difficult. He stayed in touch with Carter and Chen, the three veterans maintaining a bond forged in shared experience. They attended reunions of their division, standing among dwindling numbers of survivors, remembering fallen friends, keeping alive the memory of what they'd done and why it had mattered. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, James returned to Normandy with Catherine. They walked along Omaha Beach, now peaceful and beautiful, marked by an American cemetery where white crosses stretched in perfect rows as far as the eye could see. James found the graves of Marcus Johnson and Daniel Chen, and so many others, men who died on that beach 40 years ago, who'd never gotten the chance to go home, to marry, to have children, to live the lives James had been fortunate enough to live. He knelt at Marcus's grave, his old knees protesting, and placed his hand on the white marble cross. "I made it, brother," he said quietly. "I survived, came home, built a good life. I've tried to live in a way that honors your sacrifice, that makes your death mean something. I hope I've succeeded. I hope you'd be proud." Catherine stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, understanding without words the weight he carried, the debt he felt to those who died. "They would be proud," she said, "of the man you became, the life you built, the way you've honored their memory. You've done everything they could have hoped for." James stood, looking out at the beach where he'd landed 40 years ago, where he'd been terrified and young and certain he was about to die. That day had changed everything, had changed him, had changed the world, had set in motion everything that had followed. It had been the worst day of his life, and also, in a strange way, the most important. "Let's go home," he said to Catherine. "I've said my goodbyes." They returned to Portland, to the life they'd built together, to children and grandchildren, and a community where James was respected as a teacher, a veteran, and a man of integrity. He lived to see the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, the survival of the freedom he'd fought for. He lived to see his grandchildren grow up in a world shaped by the sacrifices made on Omaha Beach and in the hedgerows and at Bastogne. And when James Sullivan finally passed away in 2008, at the age of 86, he died surrounded by family, having lived a full and meaningful life. His funeral was attended by hundreds, students he'd taught, fellow veterans, family and friends whose lives he'd touched. An honor guard from the local VFW fired a salute, and a bugler played taps as his casket was lowered into the ground. In his effects, his children found the letters he'd written during the war, the first one before D-Day, and others written from France and Belgium and Germany. They also found a final letter, written just months before his death, addressed to his family. "To my beloved family. If you're reading this, I've completed my final mission. I've lived my life as fully and honorably as I could, and now I've gone to join the brothers who fell before me. I want you to know that I have no regrets. The war changed me, scarred me, haunted me for years, but it also made me who I became, a man who understood the value of freedom, who appreciated every day of peace, who knew that standing up for what's right is always worth the cost. I fought in World War II because my country needed me. I survived when so many others didn't, and I've spent the rest of my life trying to honor their sacrifice by living well, by raising good children, by contributing to my community, by being the kind of American they died believing in. I've lived to see my children grow up, to hold my grandchildren, to watch the world change in ways both good and bad. I've had love, family, purpose and meaning. I've had a life worth living, and I owe that life to every soldier who died on a French beach, or in a Belgian forest, or in any of the countless places where Americans fought and bled for freedom. Remember their sacrifice. Remember that freedom isn't free, that someone always has to pay the price. Remember that being American means standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs everything. That's the lesson I learned in the war, and it's the legacy I want to leave you. I love you all. Live well, love deeply, stand up for what's right, and never forget what makes America great. Not our power or our wealth, but our commitment to ideals that transcend national borders. Freedom, justice, the belief that all people deserve to live without fear. That's what I fought for, that's what I lived for, and that's what I hope you'll carry forward. With all my love, James Sullivan, Sergeant, United States Army, European Theatre, 1944-1945. The letter was read at his funeral, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church. James Sullivan had been a hero, though he'd never claimed that title. He'd been a soldier who'd done his duty, a man who'd lived with honor, an American who'd embodied the best of what that word could mean. His story was one of millions, ordinary men who'd done extraordinary things, who'd stood up when their country needed them, who'd paid the price of freedom with their blood and their sacrifice. They'd fought not for glory or conquest, but for ideals worth dying for, and more importantly, worth living for. James Sullivan's war had lasted less than a year of active combat, but its effects had shaped the remaining 63 years of his life. He'd been changed by what he experienced, scarred by what he'd witnessed, haunted by what he'd done, but he'd also been strengthened, deepened, given a sense of purpose and meaning that had sustained him through all the years that followed. He'd kept his promise, the one he'd made in that letter before D-Day. He'd done his duty. He'd stood up for what was right. He'd been part of something bigger than himself. And in doing so, he'd helped preserve the freedom not just of Americans, but of people around the world. That was the legacy of James Sullivan and the millions like him, men who'd answered the call, who'd fought the good fight, who'd paid the price of freedom so that future generations could live in peace. Their sacrifice had shaped the world, had preserved liberty, had proven that tyranny could be defeated when good men stood up against it. And though the soldiers of World War II were passing into history, their example lived on, a reminder that courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to freedom were the true measures of heroism, and that America's greatness lay not in its might, but in its willingness to fight for ideals that transcended national interest. James Sullivan's last letter home had finally been delivered, not to his mother, but to his children and grandchildren and all those who would remember his story. It was a message of hope, of courage, of the enduring power of the American spirit. It was the story of a soldier who'd fought for freedom and won, not just on the battlefields of Europe, but in the life he'd lived afterward, a life of love, purpose, and unwavering commitment to the ideals that made America worth fighting for. It was, in the end, the story of America itself, Imperfect, scarred, but always striving to be better, always standing up for freedom, always willing to pay the price that liberty demands. And that story, like James Sullivan's memory, would live on forever.